We will take roll call and then we'll turn over the meeting to our meeting managers. Ms. McLaughlin? Ms. Marin? Ms. Sizemore Heiser?
Hand sanitizer you have to charge for. There's a hand sanitizer to make up stuff every
Phone is on?
constantly training so I guess for my clients, they can
Someone's phone is on?
and can like force it.
Megan, your mic is on.
Okay, let's start again with roll call. Ms. McLaughlin? We will come back. Ms. Marin?
Yes, Dr. Anderson, I'm here. It's Megan.
Here.
Good afternoon. Ms. Marin, good afternoon. Ms. Sizemore Heiser? Ms. Sizemore Heiser? We will come back. Ms. Tolan?
I'm here.
Ms. Derenak Kofax? Not yet. I don't believe I see her here yet. Ms. Corbett Sanders?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Ms. Keys Gamara?
I'm here.
Ms. Pekarsky?
Hello, I'm here.
Ms. Omesh?
Here.
Ms. Cohen?
Also here.
Mr. Frisch?
I'm here.
Ms. Derenak Kofax?
I'm here. I don't know.
We can hear you now. Thank you. Ms. Sizemore Heiser? I do believe Ms. Sizemore Heiser has not joined us yet. At this time, we will turn over the meeting to our meeting manager for the first section, Ms. Keys Gamara.
Hi, everybody. Is Ms. Coe here?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, everyone.
All right, I just wanted to make sure, I wanted to see how long I needed to talk before I introduced you. Okay, thank you, Ms. Coe, for being here. As you guys know, she is our Auditor General Extraordinaire, and she has some recommendations for us today. So I will let her give her report, and then we can take questions if anybody has any questions. Thank you, Ms. Coe.
Thank you, Ms. Keys Kamara. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for the school board to allow my office today to go over two audit-related topics. The first one is the fiscal year 20 mid-year OAG report. And the second item is the fiscal year 21 risk assessment and audit plan. The first item, the mid-year OAG report, is for information. And the key outcome from today's meeting is for the school board to review the fiscal year 21 audit plan. This item is on the approval agenda for the school board meeting tomorrow. Before we start, I would like to introduce my team virtually, and who are Ms. Teresa Weatherman. She is our Deputy Auditor General. Danielle Moore, who is our Auditor 3, and Chris Elliott, who is our Auditor 3. So thank you to be with me, and we are here as a team to respond to any questions that the school board may have for us. All these documents have been previously been discussed at the audit committee table. I specifically would like to thank all the school board members submitting ideas and feedback to me regarding the FY21 plan. This meant a lot to my office to ensure the plan is collaborative and excelled with the school board expectations. And at the same time, I would like to relay my sincere appreciation to Dr. Brabrand and his team for the continued support and collaboration throughout the 3 years that I have been with the divisions that it always is an open dialogue. Working with the auditors can be a unique experience that some of the people may not be used to, and the school board and the division have been providing us with the entire support all the time. So really thankful for that. And this is my fourth year in presenting plan to the school board. And this time I would really like to include even more enhance the lens through the financial, reputational, and operational aspects, and thus come up with a well-balanced audit plan to be presented. And first, to start off though, before we talk into the fiscal year 21 audit plan, I would like to highlight the fiscal year 20 OAG mid-year report. This is a recommendation made by the previous audit committee to my office. They were like, you know what, Esther, your office has been doing a lot of great work. Could we take the accomplishments of what we have achieved and also the projects that we are looking forward? Thus, we started to prepare the mid-year as well as the annual report about our office started from last year. And this time in the fiscal year 20 mid-year report, we highlighted the completion of multiple audits, including the FY19 Local School Activity Fund audit, the Grants Administration Accounting and Monitoring audit, as well as the time and attendance audit. The report also highlights our outreach and also education initiative. This is a pretty light report, so I am sure that you all have taken a look at it, and I would like to receive your feedback in a little bit. And also at the same time, I think the mid-year report set up a very good tone for us to start to discuss the FY21 audit plan, because we can look at the platform and the foundation of what we have built so far, and then to continue to enhance our oversight program. So with that, during the July 9th school board meeting, I have already presented the FY21 risk assessment and audit plan with school board. So today I would prefer, rather than I go through the same presentation again, I would love to, leave more time for a dialogue with you all so that we can answer any questions and take any feedback. During this time, though, I do want to ask if our Madam Clerk can put up the fiscal year 21 risk assessment and audit plan presentation, because I would like to have the audit topics that can be put in front of us, and then that can generate more questions for dialogue. Thank you. So the page that I want to get to is this slide. It's slide 4. If you can follow us, is on the presentation. Here are the key outcomes of the fiscal year 21 OAG operational plan. 2 quick items I would like to highlight is after my presentation to the school board on July 9th, we subsequently had the audit committee meeting. So the audit committee provided a few more very insightful feedback. So I have already included in this presentation. So I would like to highlight for the school board members so that you know about the changes that I have made since the presentation on the 9th. And the changes are, I'm going to go over there on the PowerPoint. The first change is on the audit item number 7, which is the business continuity plan. The audit committee recommended that we should reach out to organizations, which my office is also planning to do. And specifically, the audit committee suggested my office reach out to the FCPS Technology Advisory Council, as well as Fairfax County government, to learn about the best practices in other industry, as well as at the government, at the county government. So that's the one small change that I added an asterisk at the bottom of the slide. And then the second change that was made to the presentation, I added the slide 14 which discuss about the OAG outreach initiative that I would like to highlight to the school board members as well. So while we have been doing a lot of good work inside, how could we ensure that we have a robust communication plan so that our employee community as well as our community members can understand the work that we have put together and then can support the work of OAG. So on this slide, you can see that we outlined a few things that we have been targeted on, including the audit bus, which is a periodical that OAG Office of Auditor General has put together that's sent out on a quarterly basis right now, that highlight the key audit findings, key audit recommendations. Some of them include the audit education too. We have used more of a layman term to describe what we do, because I know that using accounting and auditing jargon doesn't help to understand what we do and who we are. So we try to approach it in that way for the audit bus. And you can see that our subscriptions to the audit bus has been continuously increasing. And I think now we are almost hitting the 1,200 marks. And then we also will continue to do the mid-year and annual report for the office. So you will be hearing regularly from us about the progress that the office has made. At the same time, we also have done some upgrade to our website so that for example, the information about OAG is reporting directly to the school board. And also there are a couple of channels that our community members can reach out to us to share concerns or any feedback. Last but not the least is the social media pilot. We know that in today's world, we have, in order for us to be effectively communicate with our stakeholders, to have a social media presence is critical. So we will be piloting some of the social media posting that my office will be providing the contents, and like to seek the school board member support, because I know you all have different social media platforms, so that we can provide the contents and you can help us to channel them to the appropriate stakeholders in the communities. So with that, I think this is what I would like to highlight for the presentations. And I would like to hand the time back to Ms. Keys Kamara and then to lead us through the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ko. I am going to ask my colleagues if they have any questions, particularly about the audit plan. I don't see any hands raised at this time. So I'd like to give folks an opportunity to raise any concerns. Okay. Well, okay. Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. I don't have any concerns about the audit plan. I just want to personally thank Ms. Ko for the excellent work that you have done on behalf of the school board. It is with your attention to detail and intentional approach to audit that we are able to hold the school system more accountable. It ensures transparency, and I especially appreciate your dual focus on both financial and reputational risk. It is just a wonderful thing to be able to see how you have evolved the function of the Auditor General under your tenure. And so we are very appreciative of everything that you do. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. Thank you.
All right, Ms. McLaughlin.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Ko, I wanted to see if you or Ms. Keys-Gamarra might be able to share whether or not the audit committee was discussing the challenges that the school division encountered with the spring distance learning. One of the things that I know is important with the Office of the Auditor General is to have a well-established work plan for the year, but that we also need to be very nimble as an organization when serious challenges are brought to bear with the system. And as Ms. Keys-Gamarra noted, and also Ms. Corbett-Sanders, that reputational risk, as well as just operational risk, legal risks, all play a role in this board's accountability for the system. I continue to hear from families their concerns about, as well as teachers too. And now we're about to roll into our fall school year, and I am hearing from families that there are challenges right now for our early summer school, the ESY program, for our students, that there are challenges with links being changed, audio not working. And so I was hoping you could maybe provide some guidance, if nothing else, to the board about how we can be responsible in what we're hearing from our community, and play a role in supporting the superintendent, but ensuring that we have an accurate grasp of where we are. And then finally, with that, I have been asked by the community if a survey was done of our parents as well as our teachers on what was the overall experience with distance learning this spring, so that it can inform us on all of the operational and technical challenges that are the basis of virtual instruction. So I apologize if that's sort of lengthy, but I appreciate any insight or guidance you can share with me and my board colleagues.
Thank you, McLaughlin. So maybe I can chime in first, and then Ms. Keys-Kamara, if you have any, or other audit committee members have any other thoughts to add, and please do so. So first of all, I do acknowledge that there are the different questions related to our bread and butter of what we do about the instructions. One thing, I guess, is a disadvantage, or it can be an advantage for the auditors, is that most of the time we are looking at the historical data, right? So many times we have to wait until to see how, the rollout would be like, what is the criteria to do so that we can audit the information accordingly. But having said that, I think one thought I have in mind, and I think Ms. McLaughlin, you and I have discussed that in the past as well, is to evaluate the critical enterprise risk for the divisions. And I believe some years ago, around 2013, an enterprise risk management effort has been started. And I believe this particular key topic about the quality of the instructions in this changing world with the pandemic eyes, how could we timely evaluate the different types of risk, right? And you have correctly pointed out the financial, operational, reputational risk, right? To have a scorecard or template managed by the superintendent office, and my office is happy, to facilitate the process. Of course, we cannot be the owner, but we can serve in a role to facilitate the process if this is something that the school board and the administration is interested to do. So that will be my initial thought at this time. And if I may also highlight one of the proposed audit topic, which is the business continuity plan audit, which is listed as item number 7 of the plan. Even though this particular audit is more tailored towards the day-to-day operations and to ensure that there is a continuity of providing our services, we will be looking at the overarching division continuity plan when disasters happen, similar to Mr. and Mrs. COVID visit. So I think that some of the aspects of how our stakeholders manage their risk will be assessed through that audit lens as well. So with that, I don't know if any audit committee members have any other thoughts to include.
So thank you, Ms. Coe. I wanted to make sure that our board members understood that the audit committee discussed extensively that business continuity plan would be the way to address some of the concerns that Ms. McLaughlin mentioned. And so you already explained that, but I'm just looking to see if any of our audit committee members felt they wanted to add something, and I don't see any of their hands up. So Ms. McLaughlin, did we address your concern?
Well, I guess I would say that, Ms. Coe, I appreciate that what you're offering is an opportunity in real time to help the division in terms of its enterprise risk and operations to create this scorecard template so that we can start gathering meaningful data from our families and teachers about how distance learning has gone, and then to be measuring going forward. And that way we won't be finding out after the fact when it's too late to fix the problems, but just to have a more streamlined process for capturing this important feedback. Ms. Keys-Gamarra, the second piece, the business continuity plan.
I'm sorry. I'm going to give you 30 seconds when I come back, Megan, but I see Ms. Tolan, who is an audit committee member, has her hand up, and I wanted to give her an opportunity to add to your answer. Ms. Tolan?
Yeah, thank you.
Ms. Tolan?
Yes, thank you. So I guess in my mind, the business continuity plan, I think is a little bit higher level look, and tell me if I'm misunderstanding this, than I think what, Ms. McLaughlin is talking about. So, I mean, I sort of envision, and Ms. McLaughlin, tell me if I don't have this right, like what you're talking about, sort of an ongoing survey. How do we touch base with teachers and parents through, to first find out how did distance learning go, what are some best practices maybe they want to see implemented, not implemented, et cetera. And then how do we carry that into the fall, and then maybe kind of keep track through the fall, how virtual learning is going. I mean, I guess I kind of see that as sort of a job of instructional services and maybe technology, with those two components of virtual learning. So I don't know, Esther, if you were talking about, helping those organizations perhaps put together some kind of a format or something that they could use for tracking that kind of information. Is that what you were talking about? Because I see a difference between that and the business continuity audit.
If I may, thank you, Ms. Tolan. My suggestions about the scorecard is more from the enterprise risk management perspective, looking at kind of like the critical risk for the division. And I can certainly expand further, like in this fiscal year with Dr. Brabrand team, and to hold, have a scorecard to see the risk level. And again, I'm looking at more broader level. So, in terms of like the surveys, like more of the details, I agree with Ms. Tolan that it would more be a management, responsibility to check the feedback from the stakeholders.
Okay. All right. I see, Dr. Brabrand, were you trying to elaborate on this particular issue?
If I could, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, just for a quick moment, on the Brabrand briefing of July 10th, we did share that our Department of Research and Strategic Improvement is doing a distance learning study. It is focused on the spring 2020 distance learning, as well as looking at our distance learning forward for the start of the school year. It's going to look at the effectiveness of distance learning. It has a set of study questions and specific objectives with deliverables that start in mid-July. The interim report will be a little bit later this month, and then some additional reporting later in the fall and into next year. So we are gathering data on the spring, and once the interim report number 1 is complete, we'll be sharing that with the board. And I certainly agree with Ms. McLaughlin. We have lessons learned from the spring. We certainly need to be ready in the fall as we start the first part of the school year in a virtual format, and I will get an update on when that interim report deliverable will be complete. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. I hope the board will be able to give you questions to be considered for that. Ms. McLaughlin, you had 30 seconds. I interrupted you if you wanted to summarize your last point.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. Just quickly, Ms. Coe, it would be my request of the board that we have you as our independent auditor to look at the ORC design of the study. Again, just because you come from a different lens with enterprise risk, and with that independent eye, I would like for you to look at that and advise the board, and certainly as a benefit to ORC and Dr. Brabrand to make sure nothing's missed, because I think this is an incredibly important look back at what happened and where we're going forward. And I think your office provides that additional skill set. That would be my request.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure Ms. Cole wrote that down. Okay, thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. We now have Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Thank you, and I apologize for jumping a little late. We had a little water mishap in my house, but everything's okay now. So I just had a couple questions, Ms. Coe. First, thank you again for your very dedicated and thorough work here. I really appreciate this. In terms of both the business continuity, the special education, and the fidelity of implementation piece of your audit plans, I appreciate all of those incredibly. I am curious what the impact of the virtual start and potentially the hybrid model, if and when we can pivot to that, is going to do in terms of your ability to really dig into fidelity of implementation. I saw in the timeline, I believe you said it was 5 months to complete that. And so I guess I just have concerns or questions, I guess, of how are we best able to determine fidelity of implementation in this new world we're in, is the first piece. And the second piece for all of those audits is, are we looking at in special education in a virtual setting as well as what we provided in our, pre-COVID setting that hopefully someday we'll get back to at some point of that? I guess I'm trying to figure out what's the efficacy of these audits now in this world to inform longer term concerns in hopefully someday a post-COVID world. I hope I'm being clear in my question here.
Yes, you are. Thank you. And this is a very relevant question. So thank you for posting that to me. I am actually flipping through my presentation. If the Madam Clerk, you can put up the presentation to slide 6, and I would like to talk to the school board some of my strategies in handling, this new world for us. And of course, that I do not see a crystal ball, and I don't even know what will happen tomorrow. So
you don't have a crystal ball, Ms. Coe? I was really counting on that.
I do. But so maybe let's go to slide 6 first. And slide 6 talk about the COVID-19 pandemic impacts on audit plan. And definitely our proposed plan is depending upon the operating status of schools and offices. And some of the documents or the interviews that we can certainly complete remotely. But some of the documents, they are only available on site, and that will be one of the challenge. However, I think we can always work out a plan with the stakeholders who provide those documents. So the timing to complete the audit may be longer, but we will be attempting to do more testing remotely, while we can still hopefully achieve the same level of assurance. And I think you're right, you raise a very key point about the implementation fidelity. How could we ensure that the policy or the regulation setup really is implemented at the site level, right, consistently across? So we will achieve that by sampling. We will be using like statistical sampling or like a stratified random sampling to ensure that we touch upon a good spread of samples so that we can see different attributes and to see different at different school sites, and not just a handful of them, but we will look at a good population. And then at the same time, this year, I really would like to continue to monitor the emerging risk that is impacting us, right? So even though today I am proposing to the school board with this plan, and please allow me for opportunities, may need to amend that during the year. To have that flexibility is really important because I want this plan to be relevant. I don't think this plan should be just set in stone today and just carry forward no matter what the world will happen, right? I think we should always have a agile and a flexible lens so that to help us to refocus. And then the third piece is that the new working conditions really increase the reliance for us on technology when conducting audits. So we have really utilizing some data analytics tools to make smart choices on samples. So instead of blindly just, go to the drawer, right, go to the cabinet and pull out samples, we actually have a program in place that we can put all the accounting financial information in it and then make a knowledgeable sampling from it so that we can have a higher chance, to select potential irregularities item if one exists. So that will be my lens, in this COVID-19 landscape of how to make sure our plan continues to be relevant and we are able to go to the bottom to see the implementations of the various topics that we put in mind. And if I may also address the second very relevant questions that you raised about the time, right? What are we going to look at? Are we going to look at the past pre-COVID time where it was under kind of like the previous regular way of learning, or are we changing the lens to look at how students are learning now, where, for example, you rightfully pointed out the special education review. And I think for that, we would need to examine it on a case-by-case basis. For example, we are in the process of evaluating the proposal submitted in from the subject matter, right, on the special education review. I would like to work collaboratively with the qualified offender, right, who is going to be selected to come up with a balanced plan. I always think that balanced plan is important, that we look at the past, right? The past, maybe we would not follow that way of instructions anymore. I don't know. But at the same time, to really anticipate what may be coming up so that when we kind of together collaboratively to finalize how to tackle this review, we can look at the most appropriate time frame. We are still looking at the process, but maybe we will need to look some from the past, but also looked at the newly implemented procedures as well to make sure that our result is relevant. So with that, I also want to see if any of my team members have any thoughts to add from the OAG team members on this topic.
Ms. Ko, may I just jump in and ask a quick clarifying question before you do that, if you don't mind? In particular, if you all could speak to the fidelity of implementation piece. I like your way of framing the time for special ed sort of before COVID and how they learn now. Those are both valuable, but I do understand what you mean by this, the data analytics to find knowledgeable samples and the sampling, but I guess I'm struggling to understand, even when you do the sampling, how do you then do the review of the samples you have, right? To know that whatever metric you're looking at it being implemented is being implemented properly when we're in this setting. And I guess I'm just having trouble wrapping my head around that. If you don't mind that clarifying question.
Sure. So what we have been doing right now is we ask the stakeholders, right? For example, if the information is coming from ABC schools, then they have to scan the document for us and put it in a secure platform.
Yeah. So
that we can have access to. Or the other situation that we are experiencing right now is the departments will pull the files for us, like the hard copy files, and then we view them in our conference room while we maintain social distancing. So there are various different alternatives that we can still get to the source documents. And of course, many of the documents nowadays are available electronically, and then we can go to the system to obtain. So there are various revenues that we are doing a hybrid approach audit. to try to get to review the samples.
Okay.
Does it make sense, or does it clarify your question?
Yeah, it helps. I guess for me, it's the school-based fidelity implementation piece. I understand the document piece of it, right? But in terms of if there's needing to be sort of reviews or observations, and maybe that's out of your purview, and that's where I'm a little confused, but that was where my thought was.
Yeah, I mean, at the end, after each audit, we definitely will have conversations, right, with the involved people. So we normally will do interviews with them and also clarify, like, this piece of paper kind of lead an auditor to believe this is how the system is being, or how that process is being documented. Is that right or not? So there's a collaboration process. Likely, the virtual environment, we would need to conduct virtual like what we are doing now. But so far, my experience is it has been working well, because we are also in the process of wrapping up some fiscal year 20 audit work, and that process has been working. So I am pretty confident that, and I don't know exactly how, but I'm pretty confident that there will be different avenues that will help us to be able to, achieve our goals.
Thank you. And feel free to ask your staff. I didn't mean to interrupt that piece of it. I just wanted to ask that clarifying question.
Yeah, I would just ask my staff, if you have any feedback, you can always, raise your hand so Ms. Keys-Kamara can see that, and they can call on you to respond. Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, is your hand down or up?
I put it down because Ms. Sizemore-Heiser asked the question that I was interested in. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Were there any of the staff, Ms. Coe, any of your staff members that wanted to add anything? I'm not seeing any hands at this point.
I think we're all well. Thank you, Ms.
Okay. All right. Well,
Thank you, Ms. Coe.
I don't see any additional hands, so we may be finishing close to on time, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm looking forward to discuss this topic tomorrow at the school board meeting then.
All right, I don't see any further questions, so I will turn this back over to our meeting managers.
Thank you so much, Ms. Keys-Kamara. Thank you, Ms. Coe. At this point, we'll be moving to the budget component of our meeting, and we will start with our budget chair. Ms. McLaughlin?
Yes, good afternoon. As I have shared with our colleagues late last week, we are going to have the superintendent and our chief financial officer walk us through the year-end budget review, and then we will be discussing the recommendations that the superintendent has about the funds that are set to be carried forward, unspent funds, as well as how it relates to FCPS's response to the COVID crisis. And then we will have additional information presented to us about the current federal COVID funds that have come in directly to FCPS, as well as what has been provided to date to the county government. So at this point, I will turn over the presentation to Dr. Brabrand.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, very much. It is time for our year-end budget process that we come to the board with every time around July. And just right off the top, I want to thank Ms. Burden and Ms. Wigington. They've done outstanding work all year on the budget under a very stressful time in the pandemic, and have just really stepped up and done a fantastic job. Right out of the gate, I just want to say we are taking the dollars that we've been able to fall out at the end of the year and proposing a COVID reserve to give ourselves additional reserve stability as we face this unprecedented pandemic. And I think that is the smart play here, as the county has also worked to build a COVID reserve. And of course, we had done that earlier in the year with our operating budget. So Ms. Burden, if you'd like to walk them through those elements, and then we can talk about any additional items the board would around budget.
Okay. Good afternoon. The year-end review basically provides an opportunity for final revisions to the fiscal 20 budget, and then provide carryover information to revise the fiscal 21 approved budget. This was on the school board agenda on July 9th as new business, and you all are scheduled to approve it at your regular meeting tomorrow. But before I jump into the details, I think you should know that the purpose of the quarterly budget reviews is to provide the school board with information about the funds under their control and allow an opportunity to review the budgets to determine if any adjustments are required. So for each review, financial services and the department liaisons that are responsible for finance in conjunction with their leadership teams evaluate available balances, review expenditures, and this review provides information about funds reallocations within departments to ensure adequate funding for all activities. There's basically 3 stages of the quarterly review. There's mid-year in December, the third quarter in March, which I believe was quite abbreviated due to the challenges that we've had, and then this year-end one, although there has been discussion about adding a first quarter review for next year. The first quarter ends on September 30, and so we often don't have enough expenditure data at that point in time, which is why we haven't historically had a first quarter review. That's pretty common among school divisions, but that is something that we're looking at. So moving on to the details of year end, the attachment that's with the board item. You should also know that this information is a little bit repetitive because I have to identify carryover items from fiscal 20, and then we have to add those in fiscal 21. So it's the same list for different purposes. And once the year end is approved by the school board, it's forwarded to the county for inclusion in their year end packet, because they'll make adjustments to our fiscal 20 budget based on this, and also revise our fiscal 21 budget. The revenue variance from budget to actual is a reduction of $4 million in fiscal 20, the year that just ended, and that is attributable to a slight amount of reduced sales tax and reduced basic aid of $1.8 million due to enrollment under projection, unspent federal funds that'll be carried over, and decreases in tuition and other fees that are due to school closure, like community use, tuition, parking, those kinds of things. So the total amount of fiscal 20 revenue is negative $4 million. That's the change. On page 2 are the fiscal 20 expenditures, showing a balance of $42.2 million after considering routine carryover funds for reserves, and that's the flexibility reserve for the school board and the fuel reserve, which totals $10 million. Encumbrances or undelivered orders, $24.8 million. Schools and projects carryover is $33.4 million. Department carryovers, $4.9, and then the unspent multi-year grant funds are $1.6 million. So the total amount of expenditure savings is $42.2 million, less the revenue shortfall of $4 million. So a total of $38.2 million in fiscal 20 funds is available. Now, moving on to fiscal 21 revenue, the total funds to be carried over have to be added to fiscal 21, and that's 113.4. And that includes the routine carryover funds I just talked about, a $24.4 million set aside for the fiscal 22 beginning balance, and then grant adjustments of $2.1 million. So overall, the beginning balance revenue changes total $113.4 million. Pages 4 and 5 of the agenda identifies the recommended 21 expenditure adjustments that go along with that revenue. Again, the grant adjustments of $2.1 million, encumbrances, schools, projects, and department carryover, reserves for the school board flexibility reserve and the fuel reserve of $10 million, And then a superintendent recommendation that all remaining funds of $9.7 million go into a COVID reserve because, as we know, there's still uncertainty ahead. On the next page are the transfers, page 6, that go to the construction fund and ACE. The first transfer is for $3.6 million to major maintenance. Major maintenance was historically budgeted at $10 million, but due to a negative fiscal environment back in 2014, the fund was reduced by $3.6 million to $6.4 million. And at that time, there was a promise to provide year-end funding of $3.6 million to bring those major maintenance funds back up to $10 million each year. And we have honored that promise and included $3.6 million transfer to major maintenance since 14. Also included in the transfer is phase 2 renovation of the STEM labs at Edison High School at $0.3 million. Phase 1 was in fiscal 20. That was completed, and so we're moving into phase 2. And then the last transfer is to the ACE fund for $0.2 million. The ACE fund lost quite a bit of revenue this year due to closure and are going to need a supplement of about $200,000 as a result. On page 7, after all revenue adjustments and expenditure adjustments are approved, we're left with a remaining fund balance in fiscal 20 of $24.4 million, and to be set aside to fund the fiscal 22 budget as a beginning balance, and that's less than 1%. The summary page shows the net changes to the fiscal 20 budget, less those routine carryovers, and excuse me, and then recommendations for the remainder, including transfer, the reserve, the Edison lab, and the beginning balance. The remaining pages detail changes to the other funds and have a little bit of other supplemental information, including year-end fund statements for each fund, which are just financial statements that display the revenue, the expenditures, transfers in, transfers out, and changes in fund balance for each of the 9 school board funds. These other funds are all outside the operating fund, and they're multi-year, so their funds flow from year to year with fund balances and stabilization funds as required. And then the final document, I think, is a supplemental appropriation resolution, which just transmits to the county the changes to our fiscal 20 budget for mid-year, third quarter, and year-end combined. And then the planning resolution represents the transfers from the operating fund to the other funds. That's it.
Ms. Burden?
Yes.
I guess I had thought there was going to be a little more discussion from either you or Dr. Brabrand about the $9 million that you, of unspent funds that you wanted to directly deposit into our COVID reserve fund rather than the board consider some of its delayed proposed amendments from earlier in the FY21 budget cycle. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, yeah, I mean, the superintendent's recommending that the additional funds, or the funds that we have remaining of $9.7 million, be put into an additional COVID reserve. Again, it's one-time funds, so it's different than the COVID reserve that we already have in the budget because that's recurring funds. This is a third source of funds, and that recommendation is purely because there, are many unknowns ahead. We know now that even though we put forward, what we believe for the CARES grant, there have been other needs that have come up since then, and there will be other things that come up along the way that we will need to have a funding source for. So at this point, we're recommending that this be put into a reserve as well for decision making when unanticipated items emerge.
I appreciate that, just for the board and for the audience. Certainly just even from a visual. So when you mentioned that this would create a third sort of COVID fund, what I want to make sure everybody's aware of. So right now we have recurring COVID funds And that is anticipated to how many dollars per year?
$9.3 million.
9.3 million. And then, as I understand it, the one-time COVID funds are the approximately 20 million, correct?
19.2.
19.2 million. Okay. And so then this would be adding the extra 9.7. But again, a third fund in that it's coming from our operating dollars as opposed to the federal government. But it is saying that in the absence of the federal government providing us with essential operating funds to meet the needs of COVID, we're doing the best we can with what we have. So I guess what I would say at this point, Dr. Brabrand, it might be helpful for you or Ms. Burden. Again, this was something that Vice Chair Ricky Anderson and I talked about with Lee, is just helping the board and the public at least understand right now, what are some of the unmet needs that you all are concerned about?
Sure. Ms. Burden, I know we talked this morning and you had worked on just a draft. Again, this is just a draft. Is that something that we could share with the board, Ms. Burden, at this point?
Yes, I will need to send it to Eileen or Bev in order for them to be able to display it. So if you can just give me a second. Or do you
Ms.
just want me to...
Before we go into that section of this discussion, I'd like to ensure that we respond to any questions regarding what you presented just a while ago. I do see a hand. I'd like to be able to get through that part of the discussion, if you don't mind.
Yes, Dr. Anderson, just to be clear for the board and the public, even though I'm leading this budget work session, I do not have those, I don't have that information in front of me. I'm not listed in this Zoom setting, so I don't see anybody's hands. So I will have to leave that to whoever's in that moderating presenter category to see, and I'll have you just take over in that regard.
I'm happy to call on the hands that are raised for the questions, but I don't have moderator status either. But I am at least able to see that. So if you are okay with that portion, I'm happy to call on the participants, Ms. McLaughlin.
Yes, thank you.
So we will begin with Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Burden. For those that are watching, we are forever grateful of the fact that you have prepared not one, but two budgets this year. And I'm sure that the year-end budget is very different than what we originally anticipated. So we appreciate you and your team's hard work in this area. I have one question, and it really is it's a hybrid of a question about the budget, but also inquiring whether the board needs to take formal action on something. And that is the FNS, the Food and Nutrition Services budget, has a requirement it's supposed to be self-sustaining, and it's supposed to be self-supporting. Obviously, over the past 5 months, we have done, or your team has done, an amazing task, a Herculean effort in providing food to our most vulnerable in our community. And we know that that is going to go forward. We know that we have to ask for a waiver from the federal government for that, and I am optimistic that we will get that waiver to make sure that we can continue to provide those services, because we are providing food to between 18 and 22,000 students every single day. And my question is this: does this board need to take some sort of formal action that allows you to go into the reserve for the FNS, or do we need to adjust our policies on the obligation for FNS to break even every year?
No, you don't have to take any action. All of the other funds, the non-operating funds, are multi-year funds that move in between years. accordingly. The Food and Nutrition Services program, as you said, is self-supporting and supported by paid meal participants as well as federal reimbursements. But the reason that they have a fund balance or a stabilization reserve is because if the expenditures exceed the revenue, then the fund balance is used to make up the difference. And you can see by the fund statement that is indeed what happened this spring. We did have the grab and go, and we'll receive federal reimbursement for that. But we also included pay continuity for those cafeteria workers during that 3 months. And as a result, the fund balance was eroded. But no specific action needs to be taken from the school board. That's just a natural occurrence of any self-supporting or fund.
So, Ms. Burton, given the current burn rate, how long are we able to sustain our services before we go negative in that fund? Have you done any sort of projections? So, for example, if we end up being virtual for an extended period of time, that means that we will not get any paid meal participants. And so we are required to use our federal funds, but that doesn't cover all of our costs. So I was wondering if you've done any projection analysis as to how long we have before that becomes a challenge for us.
We have done a good bit of analysis on the food services fund and their current situation. You'll see when we move to the unmet needs section of this discussion that we have included a rather large number for food and nutrition services pay continuity. Our fund balance right now stands at about $5 million, and that is probably enough to make it a month or two before it would be completely depleted. The actual cost of cafeteria staff salaries is about $3.5 million a month. But that has definitely been on our radar. That is definitely something that we've been talking about at the leadership level, and it is one of the items on the unmet needs that is a concern.
So if I could ask as a next step, if we could get a update on a regular basis on this fund, because this one we do know at a minimum, if we are pure virtual until the end of the first quarter, that is 3 months from now. And if we are expending $3.5 million a month, that means that we are $10.5 million, and we only have $5 million in the budget. So that means we have a $5.5 million. So if we could just if you could please keep the board aware of that fund, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, but let me correct something. We have about 1,000 cafeteria employees, school-based cafeteria employees, and they are largely on 10-month contracts. So we are not incurring salary costs for those staff during these summer months. It's the new contracts that start back up end of August, 1st of September.
Thank you very much.
My concern still is, I still have the concern. So if we could have updates, that would be great.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I just didn't want you to leave with the impression that we were, in a problem right this second.
We have listed that as well down as a next step, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. Our next speaker is Elaine Tolan.
Hi, yes, I just had a question on the major maintenance item here. One of the things we've been talking about quite a bit with, when we have people returning to our buildings is the ventilation, and are there buildings where we need to do any ventilation improvements? I know Jeff Plattenberg has talked to us about the fact that, we're looking at HEPA filters for some of our buildings, and that those filters are much more expensive than the other types of filters that we use. So I'm suspecting that any of those additional maintenance costs might be in your unmet dollars list and would be taken out of the 9 million that we're talking about here with the end of year funds? Or would we potentially, I guess it's all the same money pot, I guess, look at, this major maintenance? Is 3.5 million going to be enough for the basic maintenance plus anything additional that we need to do to make our buildings as safe as possible given COVID-19?
Well, the 3.6 million basically just makes the major maintenance fund whole. As I said, back in 2014, the board experienced and the school system experienced some fiscal challenges. And although historically the major maintenance fund had been 10 million, it got reduced down to 6.4 million with a promise that 3.6 million of year-end funds every year would be set aside for major maintenance to bring it back up to the 10 million. And so this allocation of 3.6 million into the major maintenance fund is pretty much just business as usual. As far as anything additional that needs to be done, and if there is a funding for that, Mr. Plattenberg would have to jump in and help me with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lee. I appreciate it. It's a very good question, Elaine. The bottom line is we're assessing everything that we have across our facility. The deal is, with the information that came out about the potential transmitted spread through HVAC systems, we've got such a myriad of different types of systems. With the introduction of exterior airflow, the ASHRAE requirements, and the report that they provided on this talked about increasing the airflow into the individual classroom, and then also the filtration of it that we looked at. The reports that have come out had stated that basically a MERV rating, which is the ratings that we talked about for filters, of a rating of about 13 would be sufficient. Now, we use an average of 8. So what we're doing is we're doing an assessment of every single classroom, approximately 16,000 classrooms, by each of our maintenance satellite offices to go out and take a look at what is the CFM, the cubic feet per minute of airflow that's provided into those spaces. Because we have so many different types of instructional spaces and so many different types of mechanical units across the division, we will then be identifying which ones may require, may being the operative word, the HEPA filtration that you talked about. So it really is something that we're in the process of doing that evaluation, of making sure that we can accommodate. Thankfully, with the board's concurrence last night, that gives us a position to go ahead and develop that. But the costs associated with that, we are unsure exactly as to what that may be, if it may be something that's significant, because we have found that there are certain filters that do provide that MERV rating that we're looking for of an average around 13 that are like 1 inch thick. Now, the base units that we have in many of the schools, just a quick primer, it used to be the code was 5 CFM per occupant, basically. And what that meant was, because we had windows, it didn't matter if you had a window air conditioning unit, what we call window shakers, you could open the windows and you would get that airflow. Well, that introduced pollutants, pollen, et cetera, and also humidity, mold and mildew into the spaces. So the code then has gone from basically 0 to 5 CFM to now it's triple that, it's 15 CFM. So that's the reason why I'm having each individual classroom measured, because depending on the type of unit and the age of the type of unit, because the average age of our facilities is 37 years old, we will have a better informed decision on specifically how we will be moving forward in addressing that. So I provide all the information to say we will be identifying what it may be and what the potential impact is, but it would be premature at this point to identify what we think that may be. I hope that helps.
No, that helps. I think it just answers my question that we need to be cognizant that some of that 9 million may potentially need to be used for improving our ventilation, correct?
Yes, thank you. And we'll go ahead and report back once we have the information compiled.
Did you have any other questions, Ms. Tolan?
No, thank you. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Omesh?
Yeah, thank you. I have a number of clarification questions. So, Ms. Burden, please correct me if I'm wrong or whoever wants to step in, but my understanding of the year-end budget process is that normally we have revenues or some sort of, I guess it could be a revenue or it could be a deficit, or surplus, right? And we look at what's left, and we make decisions about how that's going to be used for the year ahead. My understanding was it's a mini budget process itself, right? So we hear the superintendent's recommendations to how to spend that money, and then we, amend or discuss otherwise. Am I mistaken about that being how we normally do it?
Yes. The year-end budget process, well, I've only been here a couple of years, but in the 2 years that I've been here, I'm pretty sure it follows the typical process of earlier years. And that is, we provide information as to the fiscal 20 revenue and expenditure changes. And as you said, the revenue had a shortfall, and then we have funds that are left over, most of which are already allocated towards identified needs. So encumbrances, which are just essentially undelivered orders, things that we have sent a purchase order so that we have an obligation to pay, but the item has just not arrived yet. In addition to that, other routine allocations for identified needs are like the school board flexibility reserve of $8 million. We do not budget for that in our adopted budget, so we carry it over from one year to the next. If there's any usage during that year, then it is replenished back up to the level of $8 million. Same thing with the fuel reserve. There's also multi-year projects like FCPS on. I can give you a list of all of the multi-year projects, the radio replacement for buses that carry forward because the project itself is a multi-year project, but the funds are in the operating fund. So we have to have some way to get those funds in fiscal 21. So the majority of the funds that are identified coming from fiscal 20 to fiscal 21 are allocated towards identified needs. And what is left over is usually a recommendation by the superintendent as to what they should be spent on. I can tell you the last 2 years that when I did the year end, the board did make a couple amendments at the end, at year end, but those items were funded by reducing the beginning balance. It wasn't, the staff does not present an item that says we have this much money left, what would you all like to spend it on? The superintendent makes a recommendation for all of the dollars, and then we go from there.
Okay, and with the identified needs, just to clarify, I hear from you that some of these are things we've committed to, like you said, whether it's, contracts or purchases or whatever. So that's different. That's money we don't have. How much of this amount that we're talking about is planned, but in a way that's forward thinking? So that is, not, that doesn't pin us down, I guess. How much of the amount we're discussing is either being saved or planned for in the future right now?
All of it's being planned for the future, for fiscal 21.
Right, but what I mean is away from the, separate, not including the amount that we've already committed to, whether it's contractually or through purchases. Like you said, the recurring expenses or things like that.
I don't understand your question. I'm sorry.
No, that's
I think
fine.
she's meaning encumbered funding, Ms. Lee. How much of that has been?
Yeah, what I'm asking is, so we're looking at this, right? And you're telling us that this is the amount we have and what it's committed to. Some of that is binding in a sense that, whether it's through contracts we already have or purchases we've already made that we're, paying portions to. But then some of that may be either our decision to save or, as you mentioned, with a reserve, or that we are planning for certain needs, or what we're calling identified or unmet needs now, right? That are subject to our judgment, essentially.
Most of the other funds that are, I guess, unlike the things I just described, are the schools carryover and the department carryover. And both of those processes are set forth in regulation as to how those funds will be requested and identified and approved for the next year's use. Historically, we allowed schools to automatically carry over 25% of their budget into the next year. This year, we reduced that in recognition of the current fiscal environment. We reduced that to 10%. So they'll only be carrying over 10% this year, and anything else they'll have to cover within their fiscal 21 budget. The department, same thing. We had $17.8 million of requests of funds to carry over, and I believe we approved 4.5 million of that 17.8 million, and that was a reduction from the previous year's department carryover. I think it was 6-point-something million. So those areas, they're governed by regulation as far as the process and how you request those funds.
Okay. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to wrap my head around here is how, you know, we're in a place now where we're looking at whatever money was left over, but that money, I understand where there's a superintendent's recommendation, but that money is not being decided on by the board, is what I'm hearing.
The superintendent makes a recommendation. The 9.7 million that is left over and not allocated is being recommended to be a third COVID reserve as essentially a hedge against unanticipated items that are going to come up. It's the uncertainty. Like Mrs. Coe, I too don't have a crystal ball. So.
No, I hear you. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to reconcile, you know, because I heard that we're not asked to have action here in this meeting, but at the same time, we're reviewing superintendent's recommendation and making a decision on whether we support that.
No, Ms. Omesh, we will be having this action taken tomorrow during the regular business meeting. This is just a work session just to get into the details of it.
Right, but normally we have a process, right, where we review and hear one another's opinions about where the money should go based on the recommendation, right? And then we put forward amendments.
If you recall the email that Ms. McLaughlin sent a while ago, Ms. McLaughlin, would you like to jump in here and just re-articulate what you emailed to all of us after our finance meeting a few weeks ago?
Absolutely. Ms. Omesh, I really appreciate your good questions. It's excellent to see board members really looking carefully at our budget expenditures and our role and responsibility for the budget. What makes this somewhat unique, and I really understand your line of questioning, is that right now, tomorrow, when we vote to dedicate the year-end funds over to a COVID reserve fund of the $9 million, it doesn't necessarily have an itemization of how the board understands the superintendent will potentially allocate and spend that money. And we do have that fiduciary responsibility to understand just because it's going into a fund doesn't mean he now has $9 million in unchecked expenditure funds without board oversight. And Dr. Brabrand, this is where I'll invite you to maybe share a little bit because it looked like you're about to. It was my understanding in our budget chairman's conversation meetings, and superintendent has said this already with the other COVID funds, he absolutely wants to partner with the board, and before major expenditures happen with COVID funds, he would bring his recommended expenses for those funds. So in other words, this $9 million we'll vote tomorrow, it isn't a blank check. He will still come back with us and say, I wish to draw X million out of this $9 million reserve for the following ways, and get the board's guidance and best thinking. Dr. Brabrand, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, Ms. Omesh, I think maybe what you're thinking, and maybe not, I mean, that's why we talk and have conversations. There are certain things in our system, like carryover, that we do by regulation or policy, right? You could say to schools, we're taking all of your money, whatever you've got left, and then the board could look at it. right? I mean, and then one time 10 years ago, that was considered all the money from the school. So that the board could direct the superintendent to do that. What you learned just in this year end, it's typically at 25%. I did reduce it, and I shared this with the board back in the spring that I was going to reduce it to 10%. Yes, schools would get less money that they could carry over, but that we needed to try to keep some money because we didn't know how much we would have at year end. As it turned out, dramatically reducing that carryover was important, or we may not have had, funds for year end. So I think that's what you're getting at is the structure or multi-year projects. There are things as part of the year-end process where money goes, fuel reserves, and you're saying, oh, well, maybe I don't want a fuel reserve this year. Maybe I don't want to carry over this year. Those are larger questions. I mean, and I'm just saying, just purely there. I was in a school system where there was no carryover for the principals. You got nothing. If you have savings, we're taking it, and too bad. We've had a history of leaving some room for schools to carry over for certain needs, and I reduced it by over half this year. I think that's what you're getting. Is that what you're getting at about policy like year end? Why does it go? Why is carryover X%? Why are there multi-year projects? Why is there a fuel reserve?
So separate from what's guided by regulation, I think what you said was helpful, and thank you, Dr. Yearend, for delineating some of your thinking on how that's different for this time. I think separate from what's expected and what we normally do, I'm trying to get a grasp here of there's my time, but.
Why don't you go ahead and finish your statement, Ms. Omesh, and then we'll put you down for a go back?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. In terms of what I see that the current needs listed, right, are missing a couple of things. And so my concern was over the money that we have a say on, not wanting to just allocate that into a savings. So I think with Ms. McLaughlin's comment, it was helpful. And I'll speak more in my go back, but go ahead.
And Ms. Omesh, we have an unmet needs document that we're going to share that I think is going to help, but we haven't put it up yet, that may help inform what you're getting at. We're just trying to finish the year end piece. We've got $9 million in a reserve. When you see the unmet needs, that's when we can start to talk about what are the unmet needs would the board want to spend in that $9 million reserve? What would we, as Ms. McLaughlin has wisely said, do we want to look at advocating from our local support, right? Or potentially for the state as the General Assembly reconvenes in August. So we're about, I think, to have the conversation you want. Your questions are, in a sense, a harbinger of what we're going to talk about in just a few more minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brabrand. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Great, thank you. I actually want to follow up on, and I'm sorry I'm having issues with my connectivity, so I'm not going to put my camera on to help with that. I wanted to follow up on what Ms. Tolan was saying from Mr. Plattenberg in terms of needs and air filtration issues. As we are learning more and more about HEPA versus, bringing outside air and even the use of UV, is that something you're building into your plans and also into budget needs around, UV filters and things like that, as well as if we're going to look to try to open and we at some point, and we need to utilize outdoor spaces for high risk activities, are you looking at tents or what we may need to use those spaces if we can use those spaces? And I just like to see some talks about additional things that you may need, Mr. Plattenberg, or thoughts about that to make our indoor and outdoor spaces as usable and safe as possible.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's a very good question, and to follow on to what Ms. Tolan was talking about. The reality of the situation is when we take a look at all of the indoor spaces that we are speaking of, the increase in the airflow, one thing I forgot to mention was if we go back at 50%, you basically doubled the CFM in the space per child. So that really is a positive thing. In regards to the filtration and the spaces, I will have to do the analysis on what it is that will be required. It may be that the filters that I'm talking about, that the ASH rate says that gets 99.9% of it. would suffice, and the cost differential of it is what I'm gonna, it's much more reasonable. And when we talk about actually HEPA filters, there are many different facets and ways to do that. The challenge that I had stated before about putting those types of filters on certain systems, it may bog the systems down and cause them to have failure. That being said, they make in-room HEPA filtration. And those units themselves we're looking at, but until I identify the spaces, I won't know where that may be an appropriate application. In regards to our outdoor learning program, I know there's been follow-up conversation and information sent to Sloan Presidio on the instructional side to include that as outdoor learning spaces as part of the overarching instructional delivery. We do have a number of facilities that do have outdoor learning spaces. In regards to tents, we've had initial conversations, and I don't know off the top of my head where that is right now, but there are challenges with outdoor learning in general. You mentioned, as safe as possible, and safety is one of the reasons why it's not the most preferred mode of instruction, but for iterative instruction, in other words, basically temporary, if you will, or as I said, iterative, it is something we're looking at in terms of the tents and trying to find out if that's something that would be a way to go. I know we were working with some folks that were in California about that. And as I said, off the top of my head, I don't know where that is, but I'll include that in my reporting back when I get the information about the filtration and our approach. And I do know, again, as I said, that there's been communication that's been forwarded to instructional services to expand that as a part. And I don't know, I think Sloan responded to that, but I'm not sure. I think that answered your questions. I'm not sure if it did or didn't.
I had one that wasn't quite addressed, but I really first appreciate that detailed answer. I guess what I would love to see as you all are figuring out the feasibility of outdoor spaces is the budgetary needs around that as well. If whatever those may be, is something I'd like to see going forward as we're figuring out what our needs are for the next school year. The only thing that, Mr. Plattenberg, I'd love for you to address, I'm glad to hear you talk about in-room HEPA filtration systems as we may need them. I'd love for you to address the UV aspect as well. There's growing, there's emerging work around the importance of sort of the UV filtration system as well in dealing with some of the COVID particles. So if you could address that. I know some in-room HEPA filtration systems also have UV, so they're kind of a combination. So if you could talk to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, well, basically the UV, we are looking at that as a part of our multifaceted approach as to how to deal with any potentialities with this. The issue with UV is the lead time and the installation and the cost associated with it. So really in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary, they're further down the list, but it is something that is just like negative air pressure into a space. When they talk about hospitalization rooms and so forth that have negative and positive air, that type of approach is rather costly in terms of retrofit, and the time, the lead time, and the installation associated with that is one of the reasons why in the report it'll come back that as an option, but what's involved with it, so you'll have a deeper understanding of whether or not the board should choose that we move in that direction.
One other question, I guess, is I appreciate that, and I guess more looking at, if we're looking at in-room filtration systems as opposed to retrofitting our systems altogether, is that something we can consider would that be a more nimble and cost-effective way to handle some of this? And I don't know the answer. I'm just curious if we looked at that.
Yeah, are you talking about basically in our design of our renovations, our new construction?
I'm talking about twofold. One, the long-term, the design renovation or new construction in general, so we have these higher or more efficient, so I'm not using the right word, built into our long-term plans, but I'm really looking at short-term if we're going to try to make our spaces as safe as possible to open our schools sometime in this next year, if that's going to be feasible given health metrics and all these other pieces. Are we able to look at budgetary needs for in-room HEPA filtration, UV filtration, and how much that would cost? I don't know if it's feasible, but it'd be nice to have some ideas if we want to pursue looking at those, especially for maybe some of our other classrooms that are indoor, don't have, have more filtration or air concerns. And, have you looked at that for the short term as well as the long term? That was pretty good timing.
Yeah, just to respond to that. I mean, I appreciate the, the question. And again, that's why I'm taking a look at what it would be for each individual classroom across the division so I can report back to the board. And that will take us a little bit of time to get all of that information pulled together. But we will go ahead and provide that as a part of reporting back as to what the best way forward would be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Plattenberg. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, would you like to be put down for a go back?
No, that was all my questions. Thank you, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. Ms. Keys-Gamarra, your hand was up. Please confirm you're no longer interested. I wasn't sure if your hand fell by mistake.
No, it did not fall by mistake. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Marin.
Yes, great. Thank you. Let me just get my video going. I would first like to very much thank Ms. Burden and Ms. Wigington. I'm just so grateful for your work. Thank you. Mr. Plattenberg, also, thank you for talking to us about the filtration issues and mentioning outdoor learning, although I will respectfully disagree that outdoor learning is always a safety issue. So, but I know that you support it. So I'm glad that you're having those conversations and looking into that. So thank you. My main question is for Dr. Brabrand. Can you talk about the budgetary implications and what that means for this fiscal year end and even possibly the future in the move to go all virtual, what that means for our support staff and hourly staff, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, some parent liaisons? Can you please speak to the budgetary implications and how you see moving money around? And I'm asking because, well, many people want to know, but also because in June, we had a lot of confusion around how we were going to manage our temporary employees' pay and benefits, and I would like to see a much smoother process for that decision-making and transparency for this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Mayor. That's a great question, and pay continuity is part of the discussion we need to have as a board. First, let me give you the good news. The good news is our operating budget was approved, has the dollars to support all of our employees in the operating budget, which includes bus drivers, IAs, teachers, regardless of the learning approach that we were in. So we have all of the salaries in the operating budget with one caveat that Ms. Burden already mentioned. Our food and nutrition workers are in a separate budget that's not the operating budget sustained by pay. I think Ms. Corbett Sanders was bringing that up. So we are going to need to look at our continuity of pay approach for our food and nutrition workers. Ms. Corbett Sanders mentioned about keeping you updated. We will. It is about $3.5 million a month for those folks. And that's one of the things, again, we're going to show you this draft of unmet needs. I think this is one of the things we need to look at. What efforts can we make? Does the board want to make in ensuring pay continuity for that group? There will be some savings, and Ms. Burden can speak to that around virtual. For example, fuel for buses. We will have substitutes in virtual learning, but we believe substitute expenses in virtual learning will be less than what it would have been at first months in person, just because of the potential for the health impacts of people having to quarantine or be out sick more when they're not feeling well, whether they had COVID or not. So bottom line, we have an approved budget that has pay continuity for all of our employees. The one group we need to look at and monitor is our food and nutrition, and we do need to come away and monitor and discuss what our pay approach will be for that group as we keep moving through virtual, because if we don't get our paid kids in, we're not going to get that paid revenue. And I've mentioned this to the state as well. Every school district in Virginia has an independent food and nutrition services department that is supported by paid. So this is not just going to be a Fairfax issue, it's going to be a state issue. And I think it's a discussion we should start having now with you all as a board, and Ms. Burden can talk about it when we show the unmet needs in a few minutes.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll look forward to that. I mean, I think it also, we could look at it as an opportunity to think about how to, sorry, hold on, I gotta get my husband and I are both on meetings, working from home. But I look forward to the opportunity to think about if could we do this better in general, going forward. We don't have to necessarily keep paying using the same pay approach and leave people uncertain, are they getting paid or not? So I hope that we can be creative, use this crisis to be creative. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Before we go to Mr. Frisch, please go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify one thing based off of what this last line of questioning. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Brabrand, but we had budgeted the same pay for people before we went virtual in the spring too, right?
That's correct.
So the conversation we have will probably follow along similar lines as to whether we choose to go forward, making sure that people have the pay that they're expecting versus finding savings.
So Carl, I think the only reason this didn't come up with food and nutrition is, as Ms. Burden said, we had the stabilization fund, right? We had millions in that stabilization. That's been eroded. Now we're getting down, like Ms. Corbett says, you can't go month after month after month until it starts to go negative. And if it goes negative, how are we going to supplement it? And to supplement it, we'll need to find dollars either using our COVID reserve or asking our local government to help with pay continuity. I don't know how much Fairfax County government has food service workers. I don't think they do at all to any kind of level like we do. Or ask the state, where we have lots of school districts that have food and nutrition, because that's the issue with virtual as a approach. You're going to have the paid kids' lunches not bringing in the revenue because they're not coming in. So it is going to have to be something we figure out. How do we support that group of employees as we move forward if we stay virtual a very long time?
Yeah, and I'll just underscore it now. That's something that concerned me in March, is following through on our commitment to staff, and it's something that I'll be eager to have a conversation about as this issue moves forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Frisch. Ms. Cohen? And then followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders.
I appreciate getting to follow my colleague, Mr. Frisch. I am hopeful, Dr. Brabrand, that you might be willing to do a work session with us for our ESPs and help us work through what are ways that we can repurpose folks. We know we have a ton of laptops to distribute now. We know, that we may have opportunities on those Mondays, as you said, to bring some folks in. We know that we had some connectivity issues, so I'm hopeful with Mr. Plattenberg's help that we can talk about maybe some of those bus models that we saw in other systems to be able to employ our bus drivers. I just definitely want us to make sure that we've got a purpose and a commitment, and I know that you feel that way, that our ESPs are very much a part of our Fairfax County family. So I think if it would be helpful to us as board members to have some of that information when we're getting contacted by them in a place today where they are very nervous. I think many of them are quite grateful to be going virtual, but are very afraid of what that means for the income that's coming into their families and their job security. So I think just being extra sensitive to that, we can help be partners in getting that information out to them.
Okay, I'll work with Ms. Burden on that. Thank you, Ms. Cohen.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. Before I go to GoBass, because I believe Ms. Corbett Sanders had a chance, I also want to make a statement and to ask a question. During our finance meeting, Ms. Burden, you had discussed some information preliminarily that there would be a meeting where the governor was going to reforecast the budget possibly. Do you have any additional updates or any more information than you did when?
No, I mean, I know that it's going to, the meeting is already set, I think, for early August, and I believe they're going to be discussing the funds that became unallotted. Mr. Malloy has been keeping tabs on that. I don't know if he's on this call, but he might be able to speak to that in a little more detail.
I don't believe on the call, Ms. Byrne. I can tell the board they're going to meet in early August. They're going to look at unallotted dollars. They thought it was going to go down about $1 billion, and it actually only went down, I think, what, Ms. Burden, 750 million? Is that right?
I think it was less than that.
Maybe it was only 200 million. The bottom line is they budgeted worse. There are some additional funds. So now the debate is this unallotted money, what will it go for? And that's really something that we need to be thinking about as a board, what our priorities want to be with the state. Now, remember, the General Assembly already had that money allotted for certain categories. So it just may be which things get released to be allotted back to the division. We'll see. The other topic, just for the board, because I think you'll want to know with the equity lens that this board has had, that criminal justice and social justice reform will also be on the General Assembly special session. So this is not going to just be a budget session for the General Assembly. It's also going to address criminal justice, equity, social justice. And we'll keep you in the loop, and we can get Michael Malloy to do an update and a BB for you.
Thank you very much for that. The other statement that I want to make is very much in alignment with what Ms. Cohen shared. I'm very concerned regarding our employees who do not have the ability to telework. I think it will be important for us to have a really detailed plan in terms of how can we maximize all of those employees who cannot telework? Are there other opportunities? Or do we just need to be more creative in finding ways for them to telework during this interim period? So Dr. Brabrand, I would be very interested in us following up on that, whether it's a work session or some sort of information for us to be more creative and a little bit ahead of the curve this time than we were in the spring regarding how we're going to keep folks engaged in their work or like work as much as possible.
Can I suggest that as a next step from this board?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. I actually did have that written down, so I will be sure that we have those two next steps. We will take the next 4 go backs, and then we will turn the mic over to Ms. McLaughlin to set up the second part of this budget hearing. Ms.
Yes, and Dr. Anson, I did want to note, I've not had a turn at all.
Oh,
but
I'm so sorry.
That's okay, but I think it's helpful for me in my final moments of budget share. I'll just keep listening, and then I'll have wrap up comments.
How about we come back to you after we finish with the rest of the go backs, so you can share your comments and then move us into the second component of this discussion.
Yes, that's what I was suggesting.
Okay, Ms. Omesh, followed by Ms. Seismer-Heiser, and then Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Yeah, thank you. I think just to clarify everything and bring us here to just be more direct and explicit, I think that's what I'm asking. I was trying not to do it this way, but I mean, I've done my homework, obviously, in preparation for this. I'm not going to ask, little budget questions and waste people's time. I think for me, I've been asking questions about when the year-end process is going to happen, when we're going to have this conversation. And it feels to me as a board, it's easy for us to say, all right, let's allocate the $9 million to savings and talk about it later. I had been hoping we'd look at some of the pressing needs and make some determinations, because I know, and I'm sure some of my colleagues feel this way, but I won't speak for them, that there are things that folks have been hoping to advocate for. When I see the needs, for example, that are listed, there are a couple things off the bat that I know are gaps I would have loved to be able to include in this. And urgently, right, before we roll into this virtual learning plan. So we're going into recess in August. So I don't know when the plan really is to break it down. And especially with some follow-on motions that we were waiting on, right? Like I remember in the budget process, ever since that point, we were talking about, for myself, I put in one with Megan, talking about looking at staffing needs for parent liaisons and school nurses and other social workers and other staff who are essential for the socio-emotional piece, regardless of how we move into the school year. But I don't really see those reflected. And so it's tough for me to say this, but this is where I would prefer to have had a process for us, as usual, to talk about this money. And I understand the need for reserve, don't get me wrong, that could be part of the conversation as well. But that's the first piece. first piece. I did have questions though. I wanted to verify this $9 million number as the full amount, you know, with all the costs that we didn't, I guess, spend on fuel and buses and utilities and sub salaries and temporary worker salaries. If you could clarify, Ms. Burden, if that's the number, that's the number. But I just, you know, it seemed a little, it's unintuitive to me. So I wanted to clarify that. And then the second piece is you mentioned you were doing something unusual or different than other school districts in the beginning of your presentation. If you can just elaborate on that a little bit more, I would appreciate that.
As far as the 9.7 million to COVID reserve, and that being the surplus that fell out as a result of school closure, you're correct. That number does represent some funding in salaries and benefits, or primarily subs, temporary hourlies, the folks that if they don't work, they don't get paid, but we have funds budgeted for them, as well as a good bit of material and supply money as well. But those savings, of course, were offset by the pay continuity, by other expenses we had for postage to mail out packets, the premium pay that we paid employees during the first few weeks as critical employees. So we have essentially a list of expected savings, and we also had a list of expected costs. And the difference is what you're seeing in that 9.7 million. And your first question, I think you may be talking about the quarterly reviews. We do 3 quarterly reviews a year. We typically do not do a first quarter review, although we're considering that for this upcoming year, just because we think the board needs information very regularly on the finances. Most school divisions don't do a first quarter review because the first quarter ends on September 30. And so you basically only have 4 weeks of expenditure data. So trying to do a projection as to where we might be at year end, or what might, anything unanticipated, or having, you know, better state revenue projections, or even enrollment, because it's always the September 30 enrollment. We don't have all of that information at the end of the first quarter. And so most school divisions do not do a first quarter review for those very reasons. But that is something that we're considering this year, just because, even if it's just not a formal first quarter, but a check-in with the board, just to let you know where things are going, so you don't have to wait till December till you get your first report.
Thank you, Ms. Burden.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ms. Burden. Would you kindly, if you don't mind, clarifying the piece where you said we do this unusual, differently than other school districts as well?
Sorry, I didn't hear your question.
At the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about something within the practice of how we do this process that's a little bit different than other divisions. And I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that.
No, I was talking about the number of quarterly reviews when I referred to the other systems.
Right. So, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe this would be directed more appropriately to the budget chair and vice chair. I'm just trying to understand, you know, with our responsibility to allocate this money, how we ended up in a place where, you know, we're being called to vote on this tomorrow, which it's what it is. And I understand, Megan, your point earlier was very helpful to say that, all right, we're just putting this aside, but with a recess and not the opportunity to discuss and really allocate this.
Thank you, Ms. Somesh. I will just say a couple of things as budget vice chair, and then I will invite Ms. McLaughlin to respond more fully if she chooses. I think the situation for us right now that's a concern is the fact that we are in this COVID crisis. So the year-end budget process is not typical, where there hasn't been detailed discussions in terms of how whatever the carryover funds can be utilized on. We are just trying to put some nickels away for a rainy day, so to speak, which limits what we are able to do in terms of the amendments that we pushed forward from February and then from May, and now to this time where we're in this situation, given the budget landscape, that our hands are essentially tied much more than I think normally has been. Ms. McLaughlin, would you like to add anything to this point?
Just briefly, Ms. Amish, I do hear you, and I just again want to reassure you what the superintendent has committed to me and Dr. Anderson as the budget chair and vice chair, and I wholly expect him to honor that, which is when the time comes that he's going to draw on funds from the $9 million in reserve that we would approve tomorrow, that he would bring those suggested expenditures for the board's approval. So it might not be, again, like a formal vote at the table, but it's what we're saying is, okay, that's your reserve fund, and if you're going to draw from it, then you need to be bringing a work session where the board can discuss how he intends to draw on those funds. He doesn't necessarily have all of the details yet, but in the second portion of this work session, we will be talking about some of the anticipated and unmet needs of COVID. So in the end, while the money is in reserve, it's sort of like a budget process where we will call things earmarked. And so the money is earmarked for this. But if it turns out that we get sufficient COVID funding and other revenue sources, or that it turns out that we don't end up needing to spend the money since we're going virtual right now versus in person, those are the things that could affect what ultimately happens with the reserve fund. But we will still have the checks and balances on this actual reserve fund once the superintendent wants to draw on that funding, and we'll bring it to the board. Does that help?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It just leaves us a little bit cornered. The whole piece of the budget is us prioritizing, right? And deciding what is most pressing during this time, or at least correcting some of the things or adding things that we otherwise see as glaring holes despite the recommendation. So that's the piece that I'm a little dismayed by, but I definitely appreciate everything that was shared.
Thank you. Ms. Heiser, followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders, and then we will turn the microphone over to Ms. McLaughlin.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. I just wanted to do a quick follow-on on my colleagues' great conversations and comments about pay continuity, and for some of our staff who are very nervous right now about their jobs and what this means. And I very much want to make sure we take care of all our staff. And I do want to emphasize the need to be clear for our staff as well as our families and out there of how we're going to utilize all of our staff that we are paying to best support our teachers and students in this new environment, and be creative about ways our staff can all sort of pitch in together, the ones that we're paying to do this, to support learning in this environment, to support the social emotional needs, to support the connections. And I would really like to see that plan, or at least get some details on that plan as we go forward. I feel, for me, it's very important that we pay our staff and take care of our staff and have that caring culture. But it's very important that we then ask our staff to do the work to demonstrate that caring culture for our students and families who are going to be trying to navigate this new world. So if I could see details on that, or if we could get details on that at some point, I would personally appreciate that. And if you could put that as a next step of getting details of sort of planning for how we're going to use all of our staff to support all of our students and families and help each other. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Heiser. Ms. Corbett-Sanders?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to connect what we did last night with and the next steps from last night, which called for a detailed plan on how we were going to utilize our staff to ensure the engagement and supports for our students in the virtual environment, and that we were looking at how we were using our ESPs in that area. And so hopefully that plan will then also translate, have the budget associated with it. And so I would just suggest that the next steps today link up with the next steps from yesterday, because they're two sides of the same coin. Secondly, I just wanted to share with you, I was talking to someone from the county who said that as a result of our going virtual, that they actually put our health aides and nurses in our schools, and they're funded by the county. And so they are redeploying those health aides and nurses while we're virtual to put them into other functions to make sure that there is that continuity of work and pay. And it would be helpful if Dr. Brabrand, you connected with Mr. Hill and saw how they were doing it so that we can be consistent between the two organizations. I also wanted to thank Dr. Brabrand because you clarified what was the specific concerns I had about the FNS fund and the fact that once those people are back on our payroll, we will have a shortage. So having a plan for the FNS fund earlier rather than later would be greatly appreciated. And I know that that is one of the next steps I've already asked for. And then last, I wanted to talk to Abrar. You know, I wanted to kind of put this in the context of the $9 million is like an escrow account. So when you purchase a house and there needs to be repairs on that house, the previous owner will put into an escrow account monies to be drawn upon as we do the work on that house. It's the same sort of thing. What we're doing is we're essentially setting up an escrow account for the COVID-19, and now we will have 3 accounts for COVID-19. What I'm going to ask, though, is that we have a monthly, and it doesn't have to be a briefing to the board, it's just a monthly statement of where we are on each of those 3 accounts so that the board has the transparency and understanding of how we're spending those funds. And that would be a next step if that's possible.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. I believe we have one last speaker, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Yes, I do want to support my colleagues in many of the things that they have said. And I think Ms. Corbett-Sanders just mentioned one of the things I wanted to say with respect to the 9.7 million, I believe it is, for a COVID reserve. I am very much looking forward to a report to the board in advance so that we can have some idea of what we are dealing with ahead of time. I am looking for anticipated costs and anticipated shortages in light of what could happen. We know right now that we, depending on what happens with COVID, we don't know how long we will have to be virtual. What additional costs might we anticipate as a result of that route? We also know that if it improves, that we may have some additional costs trying to transition back into our schools. I very much want to see strategic thinking with respect to potential costs regarding that. What I do not want to happen is this kind of emergency situation where we are getting information at the last minute and we are told in a public meeting that we have to make a decision immediately. I don't think that that's fair to our public. It does not help me. I will speak for myself. I don't believe that it helps others, but it does not help me to fulfill my duty as a board member. And I feel that we owe our constituents better than that. And so I will preface all of my concerns about anticipating, because the fact of the matter is, we know that there could be a trajectory here that we can anticipate, and we need to look at what could happen. And I would very much like to have discussions as we go forward about what those things are that we anticipate and how we can possibly plan for those anticipated costs or problems. With respect to employees that have difficulty working virtually, definitely want to second all of my board members who said we want to come up with a plan for them. I will say I am concerned going forward, since we are on this new territory. I'm always worried about how the Board of Supervisors will perceive us and how responsible we are being. And so that is why I think that this anticipation portion, Dr. Brabrand, is really, really important. And to the extent that that can be a part of our next step in terms of anticipated costs, in addition to what we have, given the various scenarios.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was also very good timing, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. There were some questions that were embedded there. Did you want to respond to that, Dr. Brabrand?
Well, I mean, her point about strategic thinking is right on. I mean, in this crisis, we have to not just think short term, but longer term. And it's clear what are we going to with the virtual play, how we're going to handle our support employees and creatively engage them to support the work we're doing. And again, I'll bring that back and work with Ms. Burden as well about letting you see. I think what I hear Ms. Keys-Gamarra saying too is what are the scenarios? What's worst case? What's best case with revenues and costs? And so you can kind of get a feel. I think there, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, you're really talking about what's the risk? How bad could we get financially? How good could we get? And we need to show you what some of those elements look like, and I'll work with Ms. Burden on that. I do want to restate, and again, I don't have it in my notes here, but as I remembered it, the state actually thought it was going to be $1 billion short. I think it was only about 250 to 300 short. So the state actually ended up doing a little bit better. So the hopes of the General Assembly session are a little bit more positive. There's also this discussion that there could be another federal move. I mean, we're all watching the newspapers now. And I will say, and I'll let Chairman Anderson or Vice Chair Pekarsky, they have been engaged already with Chairman McKay in sharing that there may be some needs, as Ms. McLaughlin pointed out, that we would want to talk to Fairfax County about. And those discussions have begun. Nothing final, no detail, and we've shared nothing with anybody. What you're going to see next is just our draft thinking. And I think that's going to answer a lot of things that have come up even in this first hour. This next hour, I think you'll see what our thinking is. Again, it's still early thinking, and we'll want your feedback on where you think we're off or what's not in there to be thinking about. So I look forward to your feedback on the next piece, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand.
Dr. Brabrand, regarding timing of information, I think that's really important.
Yeah, you know, listen, a grow for us is to get timing more in advance. I would say I think we have to figure out, the leadership team is drowning in work. And I think we've got to figure out next steps from last night are 20, 30, 40 things. We've got to figure out how we can do the work the board most wants to get done versus going down some things that are interesting to know but don't come back and relate to the key priority of what we're trying to do. And it's not easy. It's a tension. You said it to me, honestly, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, before, between every superintendent and board. But I think the pandemic has made workloads even more, and I think we've got to, and I need to be better at prioritizing, but I think better prioritization will let us get some of this stuff to you earlier, and it has come to you too little, too late sometimes, and I am responsible for that, and I'm going to work to do better.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Mr. Oh, your hand is still up. Thank you. Nathan Anubudo, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to take a quick second to ask if, because I know this was mentioned a little bit earlier, and this may be gently in the scope or purview of this budget conversation, but I was wondering if, as we were talking about surveying and talking about distance learning, if there was going to be resources allocated to also talk about surveying students for their experiences through distance learning and how that can be used to, you know, better distance learning for that group for us in the fall.
Nathan, that's a great question, and I can go back to the research department and see if they have, and they have phases, so if they did not include it, Honestly, Nathan, why don't you shoot me an email on that, or it can be a next. Well, maybe we just make it a next step, and I'll go back and have Orsi included if it's not been as part of their research study as kids come for the fall.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brabrand. I appreciate that. I will send you an email.
Mr. Anabuda, that is a wonderful idea. I know in my area, some of our local principals have done informal small group surveys of students regarding the distance learning from the spring. And it was quite enlightening to hear what some of their concerns are. And I think that will serve us well broader for the entirety of Fairfax Public Schools. Ms. McLaughlin.
Yes, thank you. First of all, Nathan, I just want to tell you both yesterday and today, it is such a pleasure to have you as a part of our team. You just ask wonderful questions and have become such an amazing asset right out of the gate. So thank you. I am fully supportive of that. My own nephew is going to be a senior this year in Fairfax County Schools. And I know that he and his friends, many of them have a lot that they want to share with our board and Dr. Brabrand about what the spring distance learning experience was like and how they hope we can use that input to make sure things are better in the fall. To touch on a couple of things that round out what our colleagues have talked about, Dr. Brabrand, probably at the most macro level to what you had said, there's no doubt the pandemic workload has been exceptional for you, your team, for this board, and our employees as a whole. And we do need to prioritize. But I do want to just use this moment then to reinforce something that the board has had many conversations with you, but I do think it bears a focus. When there is a clear project management plan, then everyone can see the plan and reference the plan, look to the plan, get a lot of answers out of the plan, and not necessarily bombard you and the leadership team with all of these well-thought questions that are coming from our constituents or coming from even our own work. And so that's why I appreciate yesterday you said that it's a 100-page document. I do look forward to seeing it, but I want to emphasize the reason it's so critical is the workflow, the focus, the time, everything should be driven by that project management plan. And that's why it's so critical that we actually have it up front before all of the months of work that you've described have now been going on. So I look forward to that. The other thing is that I do want to echo what some of my other colleagues have said. I'm proud of this board and Dr. Brabrand, your commitment to a caring culture. There's no doubt about that's what makes Fairfax County an attractive place for people to want to work for us. But that doesn't exist in a vacuum. And one of the things that we know is the Board of Supervisors and the county executive, they too want to be a caring culture for their employees. But we also talk about equity, and part of equity is making sure that what the county does for how they can redeploy individuals who don't normally do virtual or telework capabilities, how do you redeploy them so you do not have to furlough them? But what this board ran into difficulty with in the spring was that the county was making difficult decisions on where they would have to furlough employees or where they would have to redeploy them in some way, and where they couldn't redeploy, they were furloughed. Because the Board of Supervisors are our funding authority, I think it's going to be crucial that this board and Dr. Brabrand, we will have to have much more extensive dialogue before we can have a plan or a proposal for what we do for our employees. I think that's just a very important thing that we've got to talk up front. So I am very much in support, and I'm speaking over my time because I didn't do a go back. But I do think that it is going to be critical that part of this rollout to 100% virtual will be looking at how we strategically redeploy as many employees as possible. And then we're going to have those shared conversations with the Board of Supervisors and the county executive on what do we do when we can't redeploy these workers. I just can't understate that enough. And then finally, Dr. Brabrand, I wasn't sure if you had heard this portion, but we really will appreciate that when you are going to draw upon the COVID funds. We don't expect you to give us every detail to the dollar, but it will be important for the board's oversight that as you're going to draw on those funds, that you do bring them to the board for consideration so that we can support your decision making. And then finally, with ACE, it wasn't brought up, but I do want to share, especially for my new colleagues, ACE is supposed to be self-funded, and the additional $200,000 that they need for year end, that's on top of, Ms. Burden, what was the other amount that we gave them already for fiscal 20?
It's nearly $1 million from, some of it is for required ESL support and training, and then the remainder is a supplement from the operating fund. Recall that the OAG, the auditor, looked at the ACE fund and looked at many adult and community education funds throughout the nation, and all of them, I believe, received a supplement from their operating funds. So at that time, we initiated a permanent $600,000. So it's nearly $1 million combined with the English learner dollars that we're required to spend, I believe, is a match for some federal dollars that we get. The $200,000 represents, they don't carry a fund balance, and so it represents the loss of revenue as a result of closure of schools, and so less demand, so their funding was reduced as a result.
Thank you, Ms. Burden. I just want to bring this attention to our newer colleagues, because as Ms. Koufax especially can attest, for 8 years we've talked about when ACE annually cannot cover their funds. And while we, as prior boards, committed to making sure that our ESOL services are such a crucial part of our service to our community. Some of the other adult community education courses, there is a question about where we as a K-12 organization have that responsibility versus the Board of Supervisors as perhaps looking at that as just a great service for all residents. So I will put that as a next step that I think we as a new board need to look at what's happening with those costs, because even though they're own separate fund, we now are bringing dollars to that fund, tax dollars and operating funds, and what we send over to them, we pull away from the classroom. So with that, I will, Dr. Anderson, go ahead and introduce the second portion of today's discussion. And I want to just do a time check for my colleagues. We are scheduled to go until 3:30. And so for this next hour, the goal was for—
I apologize. I so apologize, Ms. McLaughlin. I certainly don't want to interrupt. I just, since you brought up ACE, I didn't know if it was appropriate for me to ask for just a 30-second go back.
Oh, of course, Ms. Cohen, I would absolutely welcome that. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I am a huge fan of ACE. I agree with Ms. McLaughlin that I think we can be creative and ask the Board of Supervisors, just like with SAC, that potentially this is a really awesome partnership opportunity. But I think that the opportunity that we have with ACE, especially with our SLIFE students, is really, really untapped. And I would encourage us as a school board to really look into ACE and make sure that we feel like we've tapped the potential there, because I think there's some real opportunity. So I just want to be careful. ACE has long been one of the first things on the chopping block when things get tight. And I just feel very called to speak up for watching that very carefully, because I think it's something hugely important that as one board member, I'm not willing to let go of. So thank you.
Well said, and I know the ACE community will appreciate you advocating with such a strong voice and valid points. I do want to just make sure for those listening, when Ms. Cohen mentioned SIFE, those are our students with interrupted formal education, and certainly some of our most vulnerable students in need of strong intensive educational services. So thank you, Ms. Cohen. So again, Dr. Brabrand and Ms. Burden, if you could present this next portion again, we have a little under an hour, but the goal was simply to help provide for all of us a little bit more clarity about how we received the 20 million in the one-time COVID dollars to meet our needs for the upcoming year. The Board of Supervisors, by virtue of being one of the largest jurisdictions in the United States, qualified for direct grant funding, and I'll leave it for Ms. Burden to explain all that, but they've been given 200 million. And so we want to just get an idea of how the different funds are being considered, given that Fairfax County Schools typically requires about 50% funding of all county services. I hope I set that up properly. And again, I'll turn it over to Dr. Brabrand.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. You did a great job with that. I really appreciate it. And again, as Ms. Keys-Gamarra said too, this is us trying to be strategic. We may be missing something. We may not have thought of things. And so we're going to get your feedback, and this can help us look at, are we capturing the right things? And then talk about a strategy about going to local or state or even federal stakeholders to get support for these unmet needs. So Ms. Burden, you want to just walk them through it, and then we can just take some questions for the last 45 minutes.
Sure. And as Ms. McLaughlin asked, just as so that you understand, in our fiscal 21 approved budget, we have a 9.3 million COVID reserve that has largely been allocated for things like MiFis, SBITs, T-specs, facilities cleaning, additional counselors and psychologists, and we have 19.2 million out of the CARES grant, and that is largely PPE, the access for technology connectivity, some curriculum resources and social emotional resources, special education remediation and recovery. And that grant application is expected to be completed very soon and submitted. And then the county received 200.2 million, and based on their latest supervisors, they have already allocated 118.8 million of that, leaving a current balance of about 81 million. And Bev, or if you or Eileen can put up the chart. And we have been working on for, well, I guess since the last school board meeting, a list of unmet needs for return to school. And again, this is just a draft, and I've put it in 4 categories: health and safety, cleaning and sanitation, instructional support, Department of Special Services support, and then system-wide supports. And I think I should be clear that, you know, with a decision to start school virtually, some of these things potentially could be delayed, but some of them are, you know, but they're going to be needed either way. They just might need that funding later instead of sooner. So on health and safety, we've got an additional $1 million for PPE. The original plan assumed 2 masks per employee and student, but we were only able to fund 1 mask because you know, we were limited by the amount of funding that we had available. Also, you know, replenishment funds may be needed, and then now we have a request for clear masks for some students and staff, and so that is an additional cost as well. Teacher plexiglass shields, this keeps coming up. My understanding is we have about 10,000 classrooms. The cost of plexiglass for teachers is about $400 each. We are able to do internal fabrication, and so therefore provide that at a much less expensive cost. But that internal fabrication is about $50 per day, so it would take a number of months to be able to fabricate 10,000. So that is on our list as well. The isolation and health rooms, We'll have handheld thermometers, and we have changed that. Instead of 1 per 500, we're ordering the handheld thermometers at 1 per 100 students. So we'll have a greater supply of those. But thermodot thermometers, which are basically like a sticker that you put on someone's forehead and it reads their temperature, are also needed. That's about 200,000. So for health and safety purposes, it totals 5.2 million. Under cleaning and sanitation, the original plan assumed 6 months of overtime for custodians for enhanced cleaning and sanitation of schools, but we were only able to fund 3 months. This 1.7 million represents the additional 3 months that ended up on the cutting room floor. Additional supplies, another $1 million, because classroom replenishment of Virex hand sanitizer and wipes, which are currently largely unavailable. We know that we will need additional supplies. We've talked about having the principals fund replenishment out of their regular budgets, but I suspect that we'll get some pushback on that. So we've included some additional funds for that, for a total increase in cleaning and sanitation of 2.7 million. If we can go to the next slide. Instructional support. The original plan assumed hourly teacher funding for intervention and support, and we allocated it based on $13 per gen ed student and $26 per FRM and English learner student. And we used those amounts. We originally started with 20 per gen ed and 40 per FRM and EL, but again, we weren't able to fund the full request, and this number represents the difference, bringing it back to the greater amount. Virtual support for English learner families, hourly teachers and interpreters at 0.3 million. We believe there'll be increased demand for online campus. That's about 400,000. Instructional supplies. This is for student individual supply kits to avoid sharing. This is something that probably could be delayed, as I mentioned, with the virtual start. But you should know that the request was for 8.1 million, but we scaled it back to 50%. Digital curriculum, there are some software needs. For Virtual Virginia, Pioneer Valley, Smart Music, Waterford, the instructional folks can probably provide some more detail on those if needed. And then technology equipment and supplies in the instructional department for cameras, computer for IAs in the preschool program, and then parent engagement for English learners such as United Language and Talking Points. So the total additional unmet needs in instructional support is 8.5 million. Moving to the third slide, special services support, August packets and equipment for adapted physical education, supplies for speech language pathologists, and other things are expected to cost about $1 million. Some additional software and licenses for those populations at 900,000. Additional staff or hourly dollars to conduct student evaluations before and or after school or on the weekends is expected to cost about $1 million. And then some professional development for special education at 0.3 for a total of 3.2 million. And then the last page identifies system-wide support, professional development. The Professional Development Office is asking for some additional positions to be able to provide enhanced distance learning for teachers and post-COVID equity issues, and that's 1.4 million. Food and nutrition services, which we talked about previously, and this represents school-based cafeteria salaries and benefits at about 3.5 million per month. If we continue that employment, then this represents about 6 months of salaries that we potentially would need for that program. Substitutes, we know that we are going to have additional demand due to short-term and long-term disability, plus folks on quarantine leave, and so a placeholder of 5 million has been included for that. And then connectivity of MiFis. we've got 1.7 million included for that. The MiFi connectivity is going to cost more than we anticipated. When we originally started talking about this, we used the historical actual usage for MiFi connectivity, but with distance learning, that usage is far greater than just using the MiFi for homework or for something when school is in session. So I think that the technology staff is looking at other options for that, partnership with a cable company or someone else to help reduce that cost. But for now, we have that costed at 1.7 million for the total system-wide support of 25.6 and a grand total of 45.2 million. And again, this is a draft. This is our first cut at what might be needed. Some of these items will not be needed immediately, but they will certainly be needed in the future. And that's what we're thinking right now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burden. Ms. McLaughlin, as budget chair, would you like to set the tone in terms of what we are wanting our colleagues to engage in during this section?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so first, before I set the stage for my colleagues to begin asking questions, Ms. Burden, one of the things that Dr. Anderson and I had mentioned in our July 6th meeting is that we were really hoping to hear the actual details, or at least the categories or buckets that the county is allocating. In this case, you said 118 million for what? I mean, that was a big piece of what we wanted for you and your team to ascertain from the county is they've earmarked 118 million, but so far you haven't mentioned they earmarked anything for the school system when we normally get 50% of funds that they do receive. So can you elaborate a little bit more on where are they directing the 118 million so far?
Yes. And again, I think that this memo to the Board of Supervisors is available online. It's a fairly lengthy memo. I think it's about 20 pages. It's dated July 2nd, and that is the source of the list that I have. Community and business support, which is nonprofit partner support like rent, mortgage, utilities, those sorts of things, 20 million. Other basic needs like food banks, $1 million. Investment in nonprofit operations is 5.1 million. The Fairfax RISE grant program for small businesses and nonprofit businesses relief is 25 million. Town contributions to Herndon, Vienna, and Clifton is 7.2 million. Contact tracing is 16.7 million, and that's 70 community health workers, 35 public health nurses. Institute for Public Health Innovation, they have a contract with them for 330 employees to assist with that contact tracing. Hotel rooms for the homeless and those that have to be quarantined, 8.5 million. Emergency response mobilization, 7.5 million. Low-income health centers, 750,000. County IT investments for teleworking, laptops, software, remote technology, phones, 11 million. PPE, masks, gowns, face shields, gloves, 7 million. Cleaning supplies, disinfectants, hand sanitizers, 2 million. Facility modifications for plexiglass and tempered glass and door sliders to direct staff pathways, $1 million. And then position redeployment for facility closure so that they can redirect employees to other functions for the COVID response is 6 million. And all of that totals 118.8.
Thank you, Ms. Burton. So I would request as this next step, I think both, not speaking for Dr. Anderson, but it was my hope and expectation that this would have actually been a slide and something that for both the board and the public that we would have at least just had a visual to understanding where the county has identified immediate COVID needs within the system. The other question I would say that we should look at as the next step is how do we benchmark our needs in the area of cleaning supplies, PPEs, redeployment of employees, and some of the other areas where there is a similar overlapping of what will happen for us with our 28,000 employees. They have roughly, I believe, about 12. In other words, we have more square footage than they do. We have more employees than they do. The 20 million we've gotten from the federal government alone isn't going to cover the third largest employer in Virginia. And that's why I do hope the board of supervisors will recognize why the 200 million they've received should include the largest employer in Virginia, one of the largest, and how we can ensure that our operations, which serves so many in the county, is also going to be equally prepared as we go into additional COVID operations. So with that, my colleagues, thank you for the indulgences. I will turn over to Dr. Anderson to start and having you get your questions answered.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. And I do want to echo what you shared at the beginning of your statements. I am hoping that we also get that information that Ms. Burden just shared, because I wasn't even quick enough to take all the notes regarding the expenditures already planned by the Board of Supervisors. So if it's possible, if you have that in a document that you could share with the clerk, so that could be a visual even during this conversation, that would be.
It's just been shared, and I'm about to send it out to you.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Anderson, I did forget to say to my colleagues, one of the other things we really wanted for this discussion is whether or not the other 10 of you agree with Dr. Anderson and myself that we think it would be valuable to direct the chair and vice chair of the board to engage in further conversation with the superintendent, the chair of the board of supervisors, and the county executive on the need for this sort of consideration of their 200 million in COVID funds to our 20 million. So my apologies.
No, absolutely. And thank you for that. And I do want to share that Ms. Pekarsky and I did have an opportunity to have, as you all know, a quick meet and greet with Mr. McKay, Chairman McKay, and Mr. Hill, along with Dr. Braybrand last week. It was really to welcome, well, earlier this week, Monday, feels like it's long. It was an opportunity for us to just kind of set the tone for our working relationship, but this also was an issue that came up. And so they are expecting some follow-up from us regarding this issue, but we shared with them very clearly that this is a conversation that our board needs to have, and we need to come to consensus in terms of what is it that we want to request and where our priorities are. And so they are expecting for us to come back to them with this conversation. So thank you. We have several speakers lined up. Well, actually 3 at this point. We will start with Ms. Cohen and then Ms. Sanders. Corbett Sanders, I apologize.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson and Ms. McLaughlin. I had a few questions, things that just immediately were quick flags. One is the low number for the interpreters and family support. I would argue that particularly going all virtual, I think we need to ramp this up really significantly. I will say to you that the parent liaisons and the interpreters, the work that they did to try to help our families who are not English speakers or that English is their second language, and just trying to get them to understand the forms and be able to really take that in and fill them out for their preference was amazing. I've never seen people work as hard as our liaisons, parent liaisons have been working during this time to make sure that every family really understood all the ramifications of what the year ahead could look like. So I would just encourage that. I think right now, especially as we've taken a virtual course for the beginning of the year, I really, really, really hope that we're going to be putting a lot of effort and energy into making sure those folks are deployed and out in our community and explaining to folks how to make this successful for their kids. The other flag, I worry about the idea of like custodians, we're just saying, oh, now we're going to get 3 months without the extra support. One, I think we're still having SAC in our buildings, was my understanding. So I want to make sure that we're having good cleaning there. And then also, we have said that we're making a commitment to getting, in particular, our SPED kids and our ELL kids in the building as soon as humanly possible. And I want to make sure that we have the custodial support to back that up. I'm hoping we're going to let our teachers come into their classrooms, and be able to teach virtually from those classrooms. So I was just concerned with the comment that because we're going virtual, I just want to make sure that our normal run of custodians can still handle the building load that I'm hoping we're going to have. The MiFis, I couldn't agree with you more, Ms. Burden. I think that we really, really need to ramp that up. I'm still hearing in our communities that folks had trouble getting those and receiving those. In particular, there were definitely some health concerns that wound up in some of our communities, like in Bailey's, like in Braddock, like in Hybla Valley, where if you checked the box that someone in your immediate family had COVID or someone in your residence, you may have wound up for 6 weeks not being able to get a MiFi. So I want to make sure that we figure out better distribution for that too. And then last is just the sub number. If we could go backtrack with that high 5 million. Sorry, that was so many questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cohen. Ms. Burden?
What was your question again?
There were just a lot of things for us to be reflective about. I don't know if there was a question to be answering at this moment, unless you have one that was, Ms. Cohen.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, they were questions, like the amount of money for interpreters and family support. Is that really gauging the increased necessity that we're going to have, especially now that we went virtual? The custodial number about the going down, how are our buildings really going to be used? And then the MiFis, how are we going to increase access to those for our kids? That's not in Ms. Burden's purview, certainly. I understand, but I guess more to Dr. Brabrand, and then the sub number of $5 million.
Yeah, most of those are not within my purview, but I think Noelle is on because Dr. Presidio is out and is able to speak to the instructional items, and then my other colleagues can speak to the others like subs and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Ms. Burden.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Noelle Clemenco. The particular item I think that you're speaking of around the interpreters, that was something that we put together to actually provide some specific training to families. So it wasn't sort of that overarching just having more people out supporting and trying to ensure that all students are connecting. So this was sort of additional funds that we were looking for out of the ESOL office to do some trainings where we would actually bring families into several school buildings and do a little bit more deeper training. So this particular item, I certainly can understand given the vote last night and some of the conversations where we probably need to go back and look at our original COVID funding, see how much we have for interpreters and such and translations and things, and make sure we have enough money in that fund. I definitely think that we need to take a second look at that.
Thanks so much, Ms. Clemenco.
Ms. Cohen, this is Dr. Brabrand. I just want to say, this is what I want to do, right? Is you're saying, hey, not enough here, too much here. That's what we're going to do, come back collected. And then I'm going to go back with the entire leadership team and reprioritize the draft. And honestly, we did the draft like 4 days ago. Then, again, each day it's kind of had different permutations. I definitely get your point, and I think some of these things now are not as important. Some are more important, and some things are missing. Ms. Burden and her team are going to take notes on this, and I'm going to bring it back to the team after I've heard all the board feedback, and then recast what I think the best use of dollars is, and then we can talk about which of any goes to the $9 million COVID reserve we just stood up. What do we go to our county for? What do we go to the state or federal for? So I appreciate the feedback, and I do think the big overriding thing there, two things. One, more custodial staffing, which we looked at early, which was a big ticket item. And so we just went to custodial overtime. I think your point is, you know what, if we're going to really get people back in school and double down on safety, let's get more custodians in the building. And the other is this connection during virtual has got to be tight. We've got to be relentless if kids are not getting connected, and I'll take that feedback back as well.
Thanks so much, Dr. Brabrand.
Thank you so much. Ms. Corbett-Sanders?
Yes, thank you. And I'm glad somebody put up the CARES Act expenditures for the Board of Supervisors. I will say that that is an outdated chart. They actually have allocated just last week or earlier this week $21 million for additional funds, the Fairfax RISE funds for small businesses. And they are also working on some eviction relief because the federal government's freeze on evictions goes away this week. So I'm just, we need to be cognizant that it's not 80 million anymore. I really do appreciate the breakout. Obviously, the health and safety conditions are really important and the instructional supports. What I would appreciate, though, because it makes it very difficult for us to approve something if we don't really understand how it's going to be utilized, is if we could have an annotated briefing on this plan so that each one of these items we have a little bit more than just a couple of bullets. And of special note is the information on requests for our special ed, because as you know, we still are waiting for a more detailed plan on how we are going to support our special ed students. So before we commit to a limited amount of funding request, I'd rather know, I'd like to understand more thoroughly how we are going to support our students with disabilities, and then identify all of the needs that may be unmet rather than just a brainstorming session. So Dr. Brabrand, when do we expect to see the plan for our special ed community?
Before we get into the answers, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, I wanted to just share that during my conversation with Chairman McKay and Mr. Hill with Ms. Pekarsky on Monday, the most recent information that they had, that's what they shared with us, which was forwarded literally to Ms. Verdon as we were in the room. I will be sure to request of them an update so that we have the most accurate numbers reflected in for our discussions. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you.
Dr.
I think
Brabrand.
it's 46 million for the RISE grant at this point is what they said earlier in one of the newsletters this week.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. I will reach out to Mr. Hill and Chairman McKay to ensure that we have the latest information. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. Dr. Brabrand, did you want to respond to Ms. Corbett-Sanders' inquiry?
Yeah, Miss Johnson or Mr. Bloom, are you there? And can you help share any updates that you have?
I'm sorry, Dr. Brabrand, just jumping back on. We had a big storm here and I had to put an umbrella down. I have my mic on here and Mike can certainly weigh in. Since we just found out we were going full virtual, we certainly have some additional supplies that we're going to have to buy and work out some individual plans. And I think Ms. Corbett-Sanders, your question was, when do you expect that plan? And I would anticipate in the next 2 weeks, we should have something more solid.
Yes, and this is Mike Bloom. I'll just add that we have also been part of the instructional task force, and our team, both the procedural team and the instructional team, have been working on plans for our return to school scenarios, and certainly the virtual scenario was part of our planning process and has been part of the planning process. We do have more specific details regarding some of the work and what we've included in that plan that can be provided to the school board. It's part of that information that Dr. Brabrand is going to be sharing with the school board. And certainly we have more detailed information related to these unmet needs that are on the list here. And we would be happy to detail some of the things that we're looking to enhance our virtual experience for our kids.
And I would just suggest, thank you very much, Mr. Bloom and Ms. Johnson, but when we present our needs, it would be very helpful to also present where we have an opportunity cost that we realize as a result of being virtual versus in person, and then where we have an operational need based on going into virtual, so that it's almost a profit and loss approach to, this is how much money it would have cost us, this is how much it's going to cost us, and so therefore it's only the delta that we're asking for. And I would ask Dr. Brabrand and Mr. Bloom and Ms. Johnson that it is a priority. Our special ed community has been requesting more details for this plan for a long time, and it is critical that we get more information out to them and communicate it in a manner that shows that I know the thoughtful manner in which you all have been building this plan.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Ms. Sizemore-Heiser?
Thank you. I'm happy to follow up with that. I have a few other questions first. Thank you. I'll follow up with Ms. Corbett-Sanders. First, I'm curious about the budget request for masks. Having just looked at this now that you just posted, is that more than two per teacher? What is this budget asked for in terms of additional masks? Ideally, I'd like to see the teacher have a box of disposable masks when we move them back in to be able to give students as they get torn or soiled. What is this actual request here, the numbers?
This is a funding placeholder because we know that we're going to need some replenishment funds, and only recently the desire to have clear masks has come up. I can tell you that right now we certainly have enough masks either on order or already received to be able to provide one cloth mask for every employee and student that desires one. We also have a good bit of face masks. We have a good bit of gowns for those that need them. But we know that we will have replenishment issues in the future. And so this is just a placeholder of $1 million for additional masks.
So in our original plan for what we have right now, in addition to this placeholder, is there a plan for having disposable masks available to teachers to give to students if masks become torn or dirty or whatever else?
Yes, we have for cloth masks, we have 300,000 total that are ordered. Disposable masks, we have 500,000 adult disposable masks, and 1 million disposable student masks have been ordered. We have 50,000 adult face shields that have been ordered, 10,000 youth face shields, and then clear cloth masks, we have 37,500 ordered for adults and 10,000 for youth.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I do want to also discuss the instructional support staffing we have here. Hourly teachers for online, EL, school-based intervention support staffing. I'm fully in support of that, but I'm a little disappointed to not see something similar reflected in our special services support. Outside of for evaluations, I do not see any budgeting here for extra staff. I know we have huge issues with our speech and language pathologists and being able to access helping students in the virtual environment. We may need additional IAs than what we have to help students with inclusion in virtual environments. Why do we have nothing here? I know our special ed department is working very hard, but why do we have nothing here for additional staff on that end? Or is that something that's been already taken care of somewhere else?
Well, in the original CARES grant and the COVID recurring funds, we have curriculum resources for social emotional at 1.1 million. We have 10 more additional counselors, 10 more additional psychologists, and
those
special
are not special education staff. I apologize. I don't mean to be rude, but this is one of my biggest passions here, and I'm very frustrated.
Yeah.
So I'm not looking for curriculum. I'm not looking for any of that. I'm looking for staffing to
Ms.
support.
Geismar-Heiser, if we could please let Ms. Burden complete, and then I'm happy for you to continue with your time.
And special education remediation and recovery funds of 2.9 million. And Ms. Johnson or Mr. Bloom can probably address the staffing issue.
So this is Mike. I'll just add that some of the funding that we've projected we'll need is built in to of the things that were listed on the unmet needs chart. For example, some of the funding for hourly for related service providers, recognizing that our related service providers may need some assistance in completing evaluations. We built in, instead of staffing positions, we built in hourly funds to be able to conduct some of those evaluations. So we would tap into our existing resources for any related service providers that would be available and willing to conduct those evaluations either on the evenings or on Saturdays. And we also have hourly funds that we could tap into some existing vendors that provide hourly service for full speech pathology services and our vision and hearing services. So some of the funding that's built in is actually hourly money that would help to support some of these needs.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. I do know how hard you all are working, but I do want to emphasize that we need to get more information to our special education families. I will say, though, that I am concerned when you mentioned budgeting for overtime for evaluations. Well, it's super important to get our evaluations done. My question was specifically about staff to support virtual learning. The only thing I've heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was an additional vendors for speech and language pathologists, but there are going to be more needs. There's going to be more difficulty. I've heard from our SLPs of how difficult it was to support our students in the virtual environment. We have counselors and psychologists are not special education staff. So I see here an ask for a board of supervisors for extra staffing for instructional support, and I appreciate that and support that, but I just don't see the same for special education. And you know, we have concerns fairly about overtime for our current janitorial staff as opposed to additional, which I appreciate Ms. Cohn bringing up. Where is that?
Thank you, Ms. Geismar-Heiser. If we have time, we will put you for a go back. We are getting close to our time.
I just have to get an answer to that question about that, please.
Sure. So I'll also add that, as Dr. Brabrand said earlier, some of the needs that were indicated on this chart have really been developed 3 or 4 days ago before the school board supported the recommendation for an all virtual start. So I know that as we anticipated and waited for data from our parent community and our staff community related to who would be coming back in a virtual format versus an in-person format, we didn't include any additional positions on this particular chart because we hadn't yet analyzed the data to see where our gaps might be. So it's not to say that we couldn't now analyze going back into an all virtual format what some additional staffing needs might be and update this chart as we need to moving forward.
Thank you very much.
Supervisors, thank you.
And now we will move to Ms. Pekarsky.
Thank you. I may go out. We've got a pretty big storm going out right now, but just generally, I think this may be a pretty big ask, bottom line number. And I think, you know, if I were the Board of Supervisors, the very first question I would ask would be, you know, not knowing when you're planning to be in school and what impact does that have on some of these asks, like the PPE, like the plexiglass. And I realize this was, you know, created a few days ago and it's ever changing, but can we, I mean, are you anticipating this changing in terms of needs? I really, you know, I worry about that question and I think it's a valid one.
Ms. Pekarsky, this is Megan McLaughlin as budget chair. I just want to share some context to your excellent question. It was definitely not Dr. Anderson's and my understanding in our conversation with Lee Burden that we would take this $46 million request and bring it over to the Board of Supervisors. This was just for us to get an idea of where unmet need was, but more so at a much higher level. We just wanted to have the conversation with them of saying, here's our unmet needs. We know you guys got 200 million. Here's how our 20 million isn't going to meet the unmet need. But so I just want to make sure you knew that. And secondly, I'm in complete agreement that this entire 46 million has got to be revised in light of yesterday's very impactful decision.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. No, I got that, but I mean, I guess my bottom line is I would like to know is where, prioritize some of these for me from Dr. Brabrand and the staff.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of this conversation also, Ms. Pekarsky, for us to give feedback to that. Dr. Brabrand, please go ahead.
I think sometimes and this is where we'll just keep partnering. I get your nugget. Bring it in priority order, but we're also trying to get board feedback as we make our final priorities. And your feedback sometimes helps us have conversations that we may not have had, something we haven't heard from the community or from our stakeholders. So I think it's a push and pull, but here's the bottom line. We did this a few days ago. Just like everything else, it needs to be recast given some decisions that have been made. And we need to do that, turn it around, and then have the board say yes. And we may need to look at it in tranches. We're not going to get $44 million, in my view, from either the local, state, or federal government, even on our best day. But we need to have the tranches set up. If we can get the first tier from either local and or state, great. If a federal group comes in, maybe there's a second tier we can get, and make sure these are the priorities of the board. So we're going to take all the feedback and then we'll bring it back to you. And I feel like this could be something we bring back at our August return to school work session with a finalized prioritization, and then you guys can say which of this needs to be part of the 9 million COVID reserve that we've already identified, and what are other places where we can go and ask local, state, or federal for additional support. And that's what I'm going to do unless directed otherwise.
Thank you. And that's exactly right. I'm trying to kind of get a handle of, from the educational impact, these are musts. There's no way around it. We absolutely have to do this. And that requires some of your expertise.
Right.
I don't have that information about some of these asks. Now, one of the biggest things I see here that we have to discuss, and it came up earlier, was the FNS approach and what we are going to do with that. So I look forward to hearing from my colleagues where they stand on that. That's it right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pekarsky. Just a time check. We are expected to be finishing in just a little while at 3:30. We do have the lead renaming public hearing at 4, so it is a hard stop. So there will not be any go backs at this period. Dr. Brabrand and his team are gathering our feedback, and certainly we can continue to provide that feedback to him in the next week or so before we have an opportunity to come back together. So folks, I do apologize, but there will not be any go backs for this section. Ms. Omesh.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Brabrand, I know some of our principals use their discretionary fund, or carryover rather, for staffing needs. Can you just comment on how that was reflected? Because, I know some of them purchase instructional coaches or parent liaison or a psychologist.
Yeah, I think you're asking, could we get you a summary of how many traded for psychologists, how many traded for social workers, how many traded for parent liaison hours? Is that what you're saying?
Not quite, but that actually would be helpful, because in my conversations with principals, some of the themes that came out was, there were certain staff that everyone was buying, or many people were buying, many principals were buying. So it might just be reflected as a need altogether. But my question was more so given that we were reducing their budget, and they might be, they may have been planning for certain needs or a certain setup, assuming they're going to have certain staff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get where you're going. Part of our staffing reserve does have a special needs request. And so principals can go to their RAS and work with HR around a special needs or unique needs reason for staffing. If it's not in the formula, and if it is not part of their ability to do through carryover. So we can, that's their process for going to get additional, but we can look at themes to let you know, like what's been traded in for and what are priorities for this fall.
Yeah, please, because I found that, many principals were mentioning certain types of staff. And I know that they can request it, though, it could get denied, right? So they tend to just buy with their own. The other piece is I wanted to ask a little bit, if you can elaborate a little bit on the intervention support staffing, whether that's different than instructional coaches, because that'll guide some of my questions.
The interventional support staffing, so, and Rachna, I think you were asking about staffing and maybe it got lost a little bit. We budgeted dollars for both gen ed and special ed, compensatory services, interventions, additional supports, hourly dollars based on the FRM of the school. So a school with a higher FRM got more money. They can take that money and have their existing staff, for example, work additional hours, after school, weekends, parent liaison more hours. And we have that for special education dedicated as well as general education. So Ms. Burden's point was when we first did the budget, we had to lower the formula numbers to drive it. I think this budget reflects going back to our original numbers, and it just gives us more people to wrap around more kids. And we can do those wraparounds in a virtual environment too. So this could be additional virtual follow-ups beyond our virtual instructional hours that we were going to have. And I think what I hear the board saying is you just want more detail on that. And honestly, now that we've made this decision, we can go back and fill that in a little more detail for you.
Yeah, please. Also, if you lose me, I have a storm too. So just in case. Moving on to the next portion, since you answered that, regarding language. So I really like seeing the virtual support piece. I'm appreciative of your responsiveness to the community on things like talking points, United Language, etc.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious, maybe there's some PD that we want to include related, especially to things like talking points, to make sure we get the bang for our buck and staff realize it's a resource they have and that they implement it well. The other piece is regarding parent liaisons, echoing certainly what Laura Jane said, so I won't speak to how important they are. I've been, on this point since I got here on the board. But I don't know if we'd want to consider some of our parent liaisons, especially in the high needs schools, have been doing full-time work. So, putting in far more hours than we pay them for. I don't know if that's something we want to think about, if they meet a certain threshold, that we just give the school a parent liaison. I've heard that was one of the themes, by the way, staffing themes that I heard from principals as well. So it was consistent with my assessment of that. And then, of course, I heard another thing about how difficult it was to have translations for our families in different languages in a way that was actually useful or rapid enough to be used by our families. So that's just another thing I'd like to point out. I don't know if these things you have in place or you have plans to do that. I'd love to hear you comment if that's the case.
Well, I would say a couple of things. I don't believe we have anyone from OPLFE on this call, do we? You never know for the budget meetings how many people to bring. Let me say just briefly, though.
I think we have Noel. Did you raise your hand to respond to Ms. Omesh's question?
I certainly can respond to the part around the PD. Just keeping in mind that, you know, this chart represents the unmet funds that were needed. But I know that Rich Polio, the director of ESOL, has significant PD plans in place for the United Language and Talking Points. It's been a tremendous elevation to our services this spring and through the summer, and we are all in on PD for that. So though you don't see it on this chart, please know that it is there.
Okay, yeah, given that it's a new initiative, I wasn't sure. That's great, thank you. And then finally, the tech literacy piece. I like seeing the professional development for special education instructors. I think that'll be important. I'm curious as to whether, one of the things that did come out of the community was, you know, parent academies or how-to videos or things like that that might be beneficial. I'd love to hear whatever is planned, and maybe that's already been covered financially. Just given the tech, I mean, the piece, you know, the tech needs that we're anticipating.
So
Thank you, Ms. Omesh. That is your time. Did anyone want to respond to Ms. Omesh's last inquiry regarding technology?
This is Teresa. I will just share that we are looking from our perspective in DSS. There are, as pointed out, there are a lot of trainings out there sitting in different offices, and I believe that there is a parent portal that's being investigated to try to group all of these trainings in one location so they'll be easily accessible, and so that we can continue to add, especially as we move into the virtual environment for first quarter, some more intensified training in one location.
Thank you very much. I will now take my turn, and then we will have Ms. McLaughlin wrap up, because we are getting to the end of this conversation. Several of us do have to move to the renaming hearing. I want to be sure that I want to echo what some of my colleagues have said, particularly Ms. Pekarsky, in terms of prioritizing this list. I do realize that the time frame is has posed a challenge, given that the conversation, given the decision that was just made yesterday. But I also am concerned regarding using this ask for additional support to kind of fund our base budget. I'm particularly concerned about making sure we are clear in terms of the parameters of these expenditures. I believe they have the same limitations on their CARES funding that we do with ours, meaning it has to be spent by December 31st. And we really don't want to, I think, engaging in staffing or recurring costs that we'll have to now carry over into the next year. So I would love for Lee to be able to speak to that a little bit. So I think I will stop there, but those are my two major concerns with making sure that we have the correct expenditures and prioritizing our asks. And clearly we will need to have another opportunity to come back to this conversation. Lee?
I'm not sure, Lee. I think. Go ahead.
She must have gotten kicked off.
She did. She lost power. Dr. Anderson, you're absolutely correct that the county has a limitation where all of their funds have to be spent or obligated by the end of this fiscal year. And that's very different from ours, where we have a little more than 2 years to spend our CARES dollars. You're also correct in that just being mindful. I certainly recognize all the needs that all the board members have talked about with regard to staffing. But even when we looked at our CARES application compared to our COVID recurring reserve, we were really conscious with funding positions out of the recurring dollars as opposed to the one-time dollars, because once they go away, we would need to pick them up in our base in our future year. So just being cognizant of that. And then you are also correct on the pieces of the requirements and the limitations of what can be spent with CARES dollars, which is also very typical to what we had, which was a lot of the PPE. Some of it is around continuity of pay, continuing to pay people, standing up food programs. So very similar to what we have. So we just have to be cognizant that the request that we ask for the county against the CARES dollars is in alignment with what those requirements are.
Thank you very much. And now we will give the last word to Ms. McLaughlin, and then we will close out this part of our meeting. Ms. McLaughlin.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Anderson, and colleagues. Thank you so much for all the questions you brought to the discussion for Dr. Brabrand and Lee Burden. I'm not sure that we now have the time to determine if the board would like at least to direct the chair and vice chair to continue in engaging in this discussion about our COVID needs and where the county is with its COVID funding. Perhaps, Dr. Anderson, one thing that you've done in the past is just email out to the board and people can respond back where their support might be for that direction. I do hope that we really consider the fact that the 46 million might look differently, but the ask and the need is still very great. And I don't think it's a matter of agreeing to all the allocations, but it is being cognizant that unless we get anything more than the 20 million from the federal government, we are being left with very little supports for COVID. Finally, I do want to just make note, because no one said this, but I think it's extremely important to the earlier conversation. Dr. Brabrand, your staff noted that we will have to figure out things like the cafeteria workers. That line item of $17.5 million alone is significant. And so that will certainly take a much broader and longer conversation with this board and with our county partners. So
absolutely. Absolutely.
Anyway, thank you, everyone. I hope this was a helpful budget work session.
Thank you very much, Ms. McLaughlin. We'll see just about all of you during at the Lee renaming at 4 o'clock. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope everybody gets to keep their power.